All right, new episode of Jung Naiv. I have a new guest. Who are you?
I'm Lea Ypi. I'm a professor of politics and philosophy at the London School of Economics. I'm born in Albania.
Mm-hmm. But you live in London?
I live in London, yeah.
Why is that?
Why I live in London?
Yeah.
Because that's where I work.
Why not Albania?
That's where I get paid. Because most Albanians couldn't actually find a job in Albania, so they've left to be somewhere else, and I am one of them. I am an immigrant.
When did you leave?
I left in 1997, when I had just finished high school. There was a war in Albania in 1997.
Really?
Yeah. And I went to study in Italy. I studied there. I studied philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of followed scholarships around, and they took me to the LSE, where I have landed.
Why did you study philosophy?
Why did I study philosophy?
Mm-hmm.
So I was 18, and there was a war in Albania. It was, I don't know if it was a war. People called it a civil war. It was actually a financial collapse that was provoked by the breakdown of what was then called pyramid schemes. So these were financial institutions where most Albanians had put their savings with the idea that if you save and invest, then you will be happy after. And those
pyramid schemes were legal back then?
They were legal then, yeah.
Okay.
And most of them collapsed, and people were very unhappy. And this triggered a collapse of the states. And so Albanians were fighting each other. There were, in my final year of high school, Kalashnikovs outside my window, and the school was suspended. And I had to decide what to do in the future. And somehow the idea that you would do what my family told me to do, which is to have a profession, didn't actually make a lot of sense in those kinds of circumstances, because you think, okay, they won't say, you should be a lawyer, and the law has just broken down, or you should be an economist and the markets has just broken down, or you should be, I don't know, a doctor and lots of people are killing themselves. So there's not really a sense in which any of this makes sense. And so all I had at the time were questions. And so I thought, what could I study that makes me ask questions in a good way? And somehow philosophy, I think, emerged as the subject that I picked. And that's why, there's a long-winded answer to your question.
And why did you choose Italy?
Because I had a scholarship there. I knew that I didn't have any money. So my family had lost all their savings in the pyramid schemes. Oh. And I wanted to study abroad because in Albania, philosophy was very tainted. It was a subject that people did during the communist years, but it was done it was approached in a very dogmatic way. And, it was very historical materialism, and that was it. It was based on very restricted readings of Das Kapital and maybe Lenin and Stalin and Enver Hoxha, who's the Albanian communist leader. And it didn't make much sense to do it in Albania. And also at the time in which I was actually finishing school, all of those books had been replaced by other books, but without people actually having the training. So overnight, the texts of Marx and Lenin were thrown out of the window and they were replaced by Popper and Hayek. So one orthodoxy was replaced with another orthodoxy. And so somehow it didn't make sense to stay in Albania. So I wanted to be outside. And then I was trying to think about where was it possible to have a scholarship. And there were lots of young Albanians then that when they went to Italy, they could still receive scholarships from the Italian state, which is not something that still happens now. There were no restrictions back then on citizenship, on applying. If you went, it was just based on needs. So I went to Rome and I had some contacts there. And so somehow try to...
Did you speak Italian back then?
Most Albanians, especially if they came from where I came from, which is Durrës on the Adriatic coast, had access to Italian television throughout the 90s. And so I could...
You watched Berlusconi.
Yeah, exactly. Non è la Rai, exactly that. Yeah, this was one of my favorite programs, was this thing that was starting to show on Berlusconi channels called Non è la Rai, with lots of young teenage girls that did like singing and dancing on television. And also lots of soap operas. The Bold and the Beautiful and Santa Barbara. And so these were the years in the 90s where everybody saw these like wonderful LA villas with swimming pools and thought that if this is what capitalism and the West offered. So but this is how I learned Italian, basically by watching television.
And your last name, is that a special last name? I looked it up.
Yeah.
It's rare, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's an Albanian surname, Ypi. Yeah. I don't know if it's that common. It's not completely unheard of.
All right. And Why did you stuck with philosophy? Because like I remember me going to university and studying business, and I hated it. And then I switched. Why did you stick?
You made the wrong choice.
Well, I had to make the wrong choice to understand that it's not the way to go forward.
No, I'm joking. I enjoyed it. It was very hard. It was very challenging for me, actually, to begin with, because although I had read like Plato and Sartre and the kinds of things that teenagers like to discover when they're by themselves and read sort of philosophical texts, I didn't realize that I had no preparation whatsoever for it because I hadn't studied philosophy in school. And in Italy, everyone started from a much higher level than I did.
Really?
So I I had a bit of a shock when I arrived, because I was not, with Berlusconi, non è la Rai Italian was not enough to read Kant and Plato and Aristotle and so on.
Academic shock therapy.
Yeah, exactly. Academic shock therapy, that's a good word. And so, then for the first couple of years, then the only way to get around this problem, because the other thing was that I needed to do exams and perform well to get my scholarship. So the whole thing was depending on performance, but then somehow if you didn't perform at the right level, then you had to go back. And I had a fight with my parents to be able to study philosophy because they were not convinced that this was the right choice. And so I had a lot of pride and investment in actually sticking and somehow making it work. So I switched I was doing more logic and kind of formal logic because this is what we had been trained in Albania. The Soviet school system, which was still in place when I was finishing, was very maths driven. So I had very good science, but no, we didn't really do humanities. And also the books had been replaced. As I say, there's like the humanities subjects were not in a good shape when I was finishing school. So all this to explain that I was really struggling with philosophy when it was written text, but when it was like formula, like logical stuff, it was easier because you had the training. So that's how I survived somehow the first couple of years, by just doing more.
Did you still use logic in your philosophy?
Well, every philosopher needs to use logic because there are some logical principles that you need to make arguments. And so I hope every philosopher uses logic. Well, I hope everyone uses logic, actually.
What did your parents want you to do?
I think my dad had these visions of how I would be in a lab doing like science and experiments. And I don't know, like he wanted me to. I was very good in physics. Also, one of the reasons I was attracted to philosophy is in the last year in physics, we did more relativist physics. And a lot of that is actually at the cusp of between philosophy and physics somehow. I remember asking my physics teacher, what is the wave? And he would say, this is a philosophical question. And somehow was interested in philosophy, in part also from science, actually, because you think about the foundations of science, some of them are quite philosophical. But my dad wanted me to do real science as opposed to this meta science that I was interested in. And so it was more like, as I say, experimental stuff. And I don't know, my mom, I'm not sure, but she was quite taken by the free market. So probably wanted me to do business or something. I don't know. She didn't say anything, actually. They were...
Could you convince them at some point in the last 25 years?
I think I'm now...
Your choice.
So my dad passed away, I think, when I had started my PhD, at which point maybe he thought maybe there was a future. I don't know. But I had turned down, when I started the PhD, I had turned down a job at the UN, which he was not very impressed by.
What kind of job?
It was something called the Junior Program Officer, which is one of the starting positions in the UN administration. This was in I think one of the UN organizations, ILO maybe or something like that. And I had that, and then at the same time I was interviewed and had my PhD scholarship, which was 1/4 of the salary for the other job. And so my dad was not very impressed when he received this letter that said, we've appointed you to this, blah, blah, blah. And then he realized that I wasn't going to take this UN job and decided to stick to the PhD.
Was it important for them to, or for them that you make a lot of money?
I'm not sure, actually.
Or enough money?
Yeah, probably enough money. I mean, I think for every parent, it's more that they want you to not be a burden on them forever, because I think that's how parents think they've discharged their responsibilities on their children by making sure that they're self-sufficient somehow. So I don't know that they had, certainly not my dad, that, he wanted, that being rich was an aspiration. I think they wanted me to do well, and they've always been a kind of family where it was very important to excel academically. But I don't think it was driven by money, actually, at any point. Also because they had been rich and then lost their money. So it's...
They were rich?
Yeah, my family, both sides, were quite wealthy. And
in the 90s or
before? No, way before. In the 90s, they were very poor. So this was elite Albanian families that before the arrival of communism had been expropriated. And on my mom's side, they had a lot of wealth, land, and so on. On my father's side, they were more... So on my mom's side, there were more bourgeoisie, rising bourgeoisie, actually.
Albanian bourgeoisie.
30s, yeah. In the 30s, and which was very small because Albania was not, it was mainly a country that was rural population and agrarian based to the economy. But they were, so on my mom's side, it was this kind of small bourgeoisie, and they became rich and then eventually were completely expropriated. They lost everything, all their flats and houses and lands and so on, which was at that point quite a lot. And then my dad's side, they were more connected to the Ottoman elite. So Albania was under the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of prominent Albanian families worked for the Ottoman Empire. So
was it an arranged marriage?
How do you mean? Well, it was not arranged, but it was,
two elite families?
Well, yeah, in the sense that in those days, so my parents met during communism and grew up actually, so they were both born in the mid-40s, so they knew in their life nothing other than communism until then the regime changed, unlike, for example, my grandparents who had also seen the other world, the pre-communist world. So in those years during communism, I think families that were somehow targeted or they were not communists or had been expropriated of the old elite searched and found each other. And it was in part by, just default, because it was really hard for them to marry into communist families, because otherwise then the whole family would be persecuted. And it was this, what was called a biography, which was a very important concept when I grew up.
Did your families mourn their losses, that they were not elitist anymore, that they were not rich? Was it important for them?
Well, they certainly, I mean, it's more that they suffered a lot. And so they had very hard life during communism, because on both sides for different reasons. But in the case of the one that was financially wealthy, they not only became extremely poor, but they were also targeted for having been rich once, and so for having somehow built their money at the expense of the people. And on the other side, it was more to do with status, political status, and the fact that they were connected to the old political elite. And so in that case, they really my grandfather went to prison for 15 years during communism. And so I don't know if it's right to say that they mourned the loss of money. It's more that they struggled, because being from a family of political prisoners was quite a hard life. And so they were sent to the countryside and lost everything, but also had to make a living in a way that they didn't really know how to until that point. So.
You said they were extremely poor in Albania.
Yeah.
In the 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
How did they manage?
So I think...
How did you manage?
I mean, everyone... Actually, I grew up in the 80s, and that was already... My parents, both of them, had state jobs. And in the case of... So when I said they were very poor, I mean, my mom's side of the family, there were lots of children, and they had lost everything. It was only the two parents that had to look after everyone, plus elderly parents. And so... I think in those days, the constraints were much higher. In my case, we were poor because it was scarcity and it was the final years of communism. Everything was rationed, and a planned economy at that point was beginning to concede and wasn't really working. The country was very isolated from everyone at that point. But I don't think I was any poorer than some of my peers just because of the family. So I grew up actually in communism without really knowing what my family background was. And I was like a communist child, like every other communist child. And there was scarcity, but I wouldn't say that I suffered more than other people.
Did your family celebrate the fall of communism and the return of capitalism to Albania?
Yeah, again, different ways. So my parents were very different. My mom's side, in part also because of this whole family background and genealogy, my mom joined the dissident movement right away, and she became a champion of free market economies and was very taken by the new system and wanted to kind of, I think celebrated the arrival.
Beginning of the 90s, probably.
Yeah. in Albania, communism fell about a year after the GDR. So here it was all happening in 1989.
Yeah.
In Albania, it took a while because the communist system was very isolated, both actually from the Soviets and from the Yugoslavs. And so it was on its own trajectory, but then somehow it couldn't withstand these shocks that were happening around Europe. And so eventually it kind of came to Albania as well. And yeah, they did celebrate for different reasons, but then I think also throughout the transition experienced it differently somehow. As I say, my mom was much more optimistic and kind of kept her faith. And even when it wasn't going well, even when we lost our savings. In my dad's case, it was different.
Like, I remember my family, like they were very happy that the German socialist dictatorship fell, and that there was reunification, and the West was promising a lot of great stuff, and German capitalism, and the East is gonna rise again.
Yeah.
And then during the 90s, everyone lost their jobs, had to find new one. They didn't get rich or anything. Lots of broken promises by the politicians.
Yeah.
So frustration set in.
Yeah.
What about your parents? Your
It
family?
was a similar experience to begin with. So both my parents lost their jobs. My mom at some point had to go to Italy to work as a cleaner and as a carer. And so and she was a maths teacher when we were in Albania, but like a number of other Albanians who just left the country because they couldn't make ends meet. Ended up taking other jobs. And these were also the years in which there was a lot of discrimination and stereotyping and racism towards Albanians in Italy. So it wasn't an easy time. But then in my family's case, it was interesting because then she spent, whenever she was in Albania, she was spending time chasing her lost properties from before the war. And then it was like a bit like these, 19th century English novels where your fortunes turn. And so we had lost everything. But then at some point in the 2000s, she started receiving back some of her properties.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know how it worked here, but in Albania, a number of families had their land that had been confiscated, returned, and so then they could, they had again some kind of capital, but as they had done before the war, not the same extent, but they were so rich that even the little that they got back was enough to actually be comfortable. So,
what did you do with it?
I mean, I didn't, because at that point I had somehow figured out my life without having to rely on family money,
Right.
And so. Yeah, she just invested it, and she had bought a couple of other flats, which she was then renting out, and so she somehow created a small business out of this returns from her family land. I think she did what her ancestors had been doing, which is to save and invest.
How long did this pyramids crisis last in
So
Albania?
the pyramids started around 94, 95, collapsed in 97. Some people became rich from the pyramids because the ones that got there early and took risk, the pyramid scheme is if you get there early, then you get the returns, and then it's only the ones that end up investing really late.
Like Bitcoin now.
Exactly. And like my family got there very late because my dad was very suspicious of the pyramid schemes, but my mom then convinced him that this is what we had to do. And so actually in their case, they didn't make any money. But it went for a few years, and it fueled more emigration and more people. There were lots of immigrants who had saved and then brought their money and saved it and invested it in the pyramid schemes, and also lost and then had to go back. And so there were endless cycles of deprivation. So I think, as I say, in the case of my family, it ended because she had this manna from heaven. In other words, she had this property that was returned to her. But for other Albanians who didn't have, it just continued. And it was the life of the immigrant, where they just have to work and keep somehow maintaining their family in Albania, also make sure that they raise their children in such a way that they can provide for them. And so a lot of them really struggled. And actually, to some extent, continue to struggle, I think.
How's Albania doing now?
Well, I always say that Albania was a very isolated country whose problems were only the problems of Albania. Now it's a country where the problems of Albania are the problems of the world. It's just that it's a kind of vulnerable link in the chain. But in a way, all countries are affected by globalization and suffer the kinds of injustices that are related to globalization. And so you have development and investment and foreign investors coming, and a question of how these goods are distributed, and the standard capitalist dynamic this, some people make a lot of money and do very well, and some people are left behind. And,
is Albania still isolated?
No, it's not isolated. In fact, right now it's in this wave of enthusiasm for joining the EU. And the EU still acts as a kind of mythical catalyst that gives people a vision of the future somehow, because they're not in the EU yet. They haven't been disenchanted by the EU, so they have this idea that if they get in, when they get in, everything will be fixed. And so the EU plays this role, which it has played in a number of East European countries, but where now the process is over, and so people realize that actually when they're in the EU, it doesn't really solve all the problems, because the EU has its own problems. But the EU positions itself very differently in the countries that are about to become members compared to the countries that are already members. Because if you are operating with an extension, kind of enlargement logic, the image that it projects of itself is this of confidence and land of opportunity and shared citizenship and so on. And of course, when you're in, as in Germany or other countries, and you realize you can see the crisis from within of EU institutions, and nothing of that makes its way into the enlargement. So it's very different. It's almost schizophrenic, I think, the approach.
When is Albania going to join?
I mean, it's such a difficult question. So I can tell you what the official estimates say, and then I can tell you why I'm a little bit skeptic. People say that now it's a very complicated process. You have to open accession negotiations, and then you have to, and they're get done by clusters and by chapters. So depending on different areas, you have to do certain things to conform your laws to the EU laws, to adopt what is called the acquis communautaire. So you have to show that you've integrated your legal system with the EU legal system. And right now, in fact, earlier this year, earlier last month, they managed to open the last chapter of the negotiations. Now, one thing is to open the chapters, one thing is to close them. And then once you close them, you still have to go through process that in every single state, member state, needs to sort of approve membership of a new bloc, a new country. So the optimism of the Commission and of the European institutions is certainly there, and it's a very important part of the dynamic, and it's what kind of drives the process forward in Albania. But the reason I'm a little bit skeptical is that we don't actually know what the EU will look like in a few years' time, because there's such a crisis.
I was going to ask.
Yeah, so...
Don't they follow the politics in Brussels?
Well, as I said, the image that Brussels projects of itself and the Commission is very different from whether you're a candidate country or you're a member country.
But that's PR. I mean, we have probably some journalism in Albania, political parties who say different things.
Actually, no. So the public opinion in Albania is overwhelmingly in favor of the EU. And I think if you're in favor of something, then you only see the evidence that you like to see that sustains the narrative.
Confirmation bias.
It's like over 90% of the Albanian public, 93% wants to be in the EU. For me, I think there is really this element that's almost mythical about the role that the EU plays in the collective imaginary in terms of what drives people forward and how they think about the future. And so I don't think they're actually paying a lot of attention on the other side of the coin and the other side of European integration and all the dysfunctionalities and all the crises of the European institutions, because you have to be inside to examine it critically. And for now, everything is played around this idea that Albania needs to do what's called its homework to be part of the EU, and everyone is driven by the homework.
But why have other southern or southeastern European countries managed to get into the EU earlier?
Well, they start from different levels of development, and they also start from, these were all former Yugoslav countries, Croatia, Slovenia. Even within former Yugoslavia, there are differences, right? So Montenegro is still not there. And so they start from a different point, and then they tick the boxes earlier, and this whole chapter opening and closes is done earlier. That's what explains why some of them are in the EU and some are not. And for a while, this process was driven by a number of countries having to kind of go together. Recently, they've made it so that you can actually apply and join as individual countries. So they've delinked. The fate of Albania was bound with that of North Macedonia for a really long time. They had to go together in the process, and then at some point it was disentangled. And so now you have a number of Balkan states, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania. In Serbia, it's a little bit difficult now. It's different because the vibes have changed, and also public opinion has shifted a bit more. But anyway, these kind of Western Balkans, they are very much driven forward by the logic of European integration, and the accession mechanism plays this role. in domestic politics.
I just wondered if the European side has to open some Albanian chapters as well. So does it go both ways?
No, it doesn't go both ways. No, I mean, it's never gone both ways. And actually, the earlier phases of enlargement, there was a little bit more a process of, so the first wave, so enlargement is done in waves, right? And for the founding members of the EU, when it was still the kind of carbon and steel community, there was a little bit more agency because all these different countries would come together and negotiate with each other and bring their legal systems to homogenize. But after that, after you had a kind of core block of countries, then the mechanism of enlargement was very top-down. And so it's just about adopting what's called the acquis communautaire. So this sense of there's this EU legislation and an EU ethos, and there is no agency. I mean, the only way in which you exercise your agency is by saying, I don't want to be in this block of countries.
Right.
But that's also very hard because if you're a very small country like Albania or Montenegro or North Macedonia, and everyone around you is in the EU and they are trading on certain terms and making laws and making political decisions based on this acquis communautaire, it's really hard to be outside. So this is also very superficial, this idea that you can say, I don't want to be part of it. I mean, even with Britain, which is a strong and large enough country and with its own development and has had an empire, it was hard enough for it to get out of the EU. So the idea that a place like Albania would have much of a chance outside is sort of an illusion.
Funny that you say empire. What's the difference between like an empire and European Union and European enlargement?
Well, I think you could think of the European Union as an empire if you didn't think. So depends on what you mean by empire. Typically, empires have involved a dimension of kind of territorial conquest and occupation and pure imposition of a system of rules. So in this case, it's not one state conquering another state. It's a block of state that sort of somehow shapes the politics and drives forward the dynamic of smaller countries in the periphery. But if you have a more philosophical understanding of colonialism and imperial domination, and you don't think it's just about territorial conquest, and you think it's more about unilateral power exercise, then I think, I would say the EU is a kind of empire and acts as such in the periphery.
Is that a good thing?
I'm not sure empires are a good thing. If you care about equality and equal representation, I mean, maybe it is a good thing for some people. It depends on what values you care about. But if you care about democracy, and if you care about equal accountability, and if you care about structures of representation that reflect the will of people, then I think empires are a unilateral way of exercising power. So it's not a good thing.
Is the European Union democratic?
No, I think even the European Union would not go as far as saying that about themselves. I mean, this has been a long debate in the European Union about the so-called democratic deficits of the European Union. And in fact, one of the long-standing debates in the enlargement, and not just the enlargement process, but in the EU overall development, has been this question of how to fix its democratic deficits. Because the idea is that you have functional integration, that countries do certain things together, but you don't really have democratic accountability. I mean, we have a European Parliament, which is in the balance of European institutions, now increasingly more included and more represented, but for a while was completely marginal, didn't really matter because the decisions were made by the Council and by the Commission. And there you don't have a lot of kind of democratic.
Like this, right?
But it's changed a bit. I mean, yes, it's mainly like that. And of course, there is no sense of, you don't have really parties that run on unified platforms, or so there's a sense in which European politics and national politics interfere with each other and interact in ways that are problematic. But just to your initial question about is the EU democratic, I don't think even the EU itself has ever thought of itself as democratic, but it was always considered to be a problem. And when I did my PhD, which was at the European University Institute in Fiesole, that's like an EU institution, it was almost like being in the Vatican at the height of the power of the church, because this was in the mid-90s, and a lot of the discussions then were about the EU democratic deficit and what to do about it. And there was this discussion around the constitutional treaty that was put through a referendum back then in a number of countries and was voted down. But it was a moment of optimism about what European institutions could achieve that started with a critique of its democratic deficit, but also wanted to develop European institutions and the sense of European citizenship in a way that would try and overcome. This is all now, we're in a completely different era and a completely different way of thinking about the EU.
Well, I was wondering, like, maybe this European democratic deficit is not a bug, but a feature.
Well, how?
Well, I mean, we could have changed it for the last few decades, and they haven't. So maybe some interest groups in the European Union, political power groups, are fine the way it is.
Well, I think. You mean it's a feature for them then?
Yes. Of course.
Okay. I see. Yeah. Right. I thought you said the feature for people who care about democracy and care about democratizing the EU. Yeah. Although I think even they now understand that this institution, as it is so vulnerable that it can be kind of taken over by all sides. And it's only driven in the way in which certain market interests, for example, want it to be driven if there is no contestation of the market in those terms. And so if you're in the moment of expansion of globalization and of commercial development, and this idea that I think you're right is entrenched in the EU treaties about the free market, the EU as a free market institution, and that develops a free market and with very little by way of limits to the free market. When there is that driving forward, it's, yes, I think you're right, it could be considered a feature. But the problem is that when globalization begins to derail, then you have more than nation states, each of which begins to emerge as its own unit and wants to do its own interests. And then it becomes really hard and the project becomes derailed by the member nation states, as it I think is what's been happening already with Brexit, but then also you can see it with the inherent fragmentary tendencies within the EU.
I see you're not a fan of free markets.
No, I'm not a fan of free markets.
Oh boy, it's going to be a long interview, I guess. No, I'm kidding. We're going to talk about this in a second.
Yeah.
What's an alternative though to the EU?
Well,
I mean, the right and the European fascists, they're like, okay, let's just abandon this whole project.
So I don't think the EU as such is a problem. I think this EU is a problem. I think it's, in terms of, we have to have, there's so many elements to this conversation. I think a transnational institution that builds a shared market, but also with democratic accountability of the market is a good thing because it's, for me, the nation state is a limit and it's a problem. And there is something negative that comes out of these nationalist commitments that are also exclusive and inherently problematic. But I don't think the EU as it is works. And so we need to think about what the EU could be, what it could have been. In its inception, the EU was also many different things. And I always think about this initial, one of the documents that was considered to be the founding document of the EU, which is the Ventotene Manifesto, that was written by the very first generation of European federalists. This was written by these Italian prisoners of Mussolini in this Ventotene prison camp, and they laid down this document that's about European federalism, but it's also socialist federalism.
Really?
So they write about the importance of overcoming capitalism and the importance of overcoming capitalism in a transnational structure of cooperation. So I think if we wanted to reform the EU, well, there's something to be said for returning to the spirit of the Ventotene Manifesto and just going back to these federal socialist roots. And so I would like to see a federal socialist Europe. I don't have a problem with that project as a principle. And I think it would actually still solve a lot of the problems that we have.
Could you give examples what federalist socialist rules would be?
Well, so you have a democratically accountable market. And, well, that you can take that further or you can decline it in many different ways, right? But it would be something like a socialist market economy, which is but a structure of cooperation that goes beyond the nation state. So instead of just having social democracy in Germany, you actually, or social market economy in Germany, you have it across the EU. I don't know if you have a social market economy in Germany, but maybe you have some people that have an aspiration to a socialist market economy in Germany. So, and I think you have that at a continent at scale. So rather than just having it in one country or in a block of countries, you have it in as many countries as are now involved in the EU. But you just change the treaties in such a way that you also give not just equal political rights and representation rights, but you also give socioeconomic rights so that you don't have just the first generation freedoms, but you also have social justice. And you could do that. There are a number of mechanisms: taxation, changing inheritance rules, democratizing firms, preventing concentrations of capital. I mean, there are so many policies out there for how you can democratize an economy. And you do that at scale, then you don't have to worry about countries. And it's done at a much more efficient level as well. And also, I think, democratically more accountable.
You remind me of my last guest. He was a sociologist, Klaus Dörre.
Okay.
And he was like, there's no democracy without economic democracy. And you were talking about corporations being democratic.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I agree, because I think that a capitalist market is inherently exclusive. And so if you think about democracy as the principle of equal subjection to rules, and, what makes democracy, as we could start a little bit, more philosophic, and then we kind of get to the market, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So when you think about what makes democracy a good system of government, it's this idea that we are subject to the law, but we also have a say in how the law is made. And so we have authorship over the laws that we are subject to, because the idea is that if you're just purely coerced by the law, that's not a good thing. You want to have a say in how the law is made. And democracy is a system that gives equal say to everyone. I don't think democracy and capitalism... No, democracy is an ideal. Now, I don't think that we have democracy, and I don't think democracy and capitalism are compatible, because if you have an economic system that leads to these concentrations of wealth and power, it means that people who are very rich can actually rig an election. Or you will remember this before the German election, when Elon Musk was tweeting and defending the AfD. And so you realize that this disproportionate power that people who hold certain assets have over economic and political life, but also over representation. And so this idea of equal representation, that it's like one person, one vote, well, it's very obvious that Elon Musk has way more power than Fritz from Bavaria. I don't know. So just to give you an example, or to just make a random name, right?
Right.
And so it seems to me that there's something fundamentally problematic about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. And therefore, if we want democracy, we need to contain, but possibly also overcome capitalism.
So if we don't live in democracies in Germany, in Albania, in Great Britain, where do we live in?
So I think it's a sort of dynamic continuum. There are moments when democratic movements and social democratic movements are more prominent in the public sphere, then we are closer to this ideal of democracy than others where they're completely on the receding front. I think right now we live more in oligarchy than in democracy. So again, going back to the definition of the term, oligarchy is the power of the wealthy. So it's when the few wealthy elites rule over economic life. This was the ancient Greek definition of oligarchy. And I think what we see now is when you have these democratic movements that kind of take a backseat, that they lose because they don't have the right projects, or they don't get the votes, they don't advance projects that would actually develop in this democratic direction. What you have is both political and economic elites colluding together to entrench an oligarchic structure. And this is what we have now. And in fact, some people would say we have tech oligarchy. I mean, certainly in the US. In Europe, yeah. But that's where you see the tendency to oligarchization of political life. In Europe, I think we still have oligarchy, because it's not that economic and political groups have no power here. I mean, it's, as I say, it's more tamed because the democratic movements and because social democracy has had a history. And so there have been moments in political life where we were closer to this democratic ideal, maybe more in the nation state level, so not at the EU level, but certainly, as I say, if you see it as a dynamic development rather than something that's either there or not there, at the moment, democracy looks increasingly like a remote ideal, and oligarchy looks much more like the contemporary features of politics.
How do the European oligarchs manage to tell the public, or that their subjects, or the people of Europe, that they live in a democracy?
Well, I mean, I think in every system there is a sort of ideology and propaganda that nurture and create mechanisms of consent stabilization, right? So how do they do this? It's a process. I think right now it's the result of decades of neoliberalism in which institutions have been privatized, and including education institutions. I mean, I don't know how it is in Germany. I can speak for the UK, where it becomes increasing. I mean, it was already a class society, and the concentration also of education in a few wealthy elites where social class really matters means that then you have possibilities of advancing economic interests because of the way people are socialized and because of the education structures and because of the media ownership. So there are mechanisms of consent formation, sometimes via the education system, sometimes via the information systems, sometimes via plain corruption and unemployment and bribery, and so all the things that are also familiar in a number of contexts. And these are the mechanisms through which you can reproduce consent in such a way that...
Reminds me of Chomsky, manufacturing consent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is clearly a feature in which the economic system has a very important role to play in what are the mechanisms from which you can develop deliberation, or you can have an enlightened public sphere, or you don't have an enlightened public sphere because the discourse is dominated and controlled by a few.
There are, I don't know how it is in the rest of Europe and Great Britain, but in Germany, there's always this fear of oligarchy at some point leads to fascism. Is that a rule, or is there an exception? Like, because like in Germany, 100 years ago, the road led to fascism. And many young people are afraid that it's going to go like this again.
Yeah, I think fascism emerges in the moment of crisis of capitalism. And historically it has done that. And it's probably, we also see this now, that you have a tendency for fascist forces to emerge. But the question is, what do they respond to? Why do these fascist forces emerge? And how does this toxic combination of nationalism on the one hand and response to the crisis of globalization on the other, and suppression of the left and discourses that fight progressive alternatives come together to encourage these social political formations? And I think in the case of historical developments of fascism, a lot of it had to do with right-wing, far-right nationalist politicians making a kind of compromise with capitalists, with oligarchs, with economic power and economic elites that would say, look, we need to place some constraints on economic elites, but without any democracy. So we will suppress the unions, we will arrest the leftists, as it was back in the days. In the case of now, you see we will fight progressive institutions. I mean, there is not a coincidence that one of the campaigns that the Trump administration is conducting is against progressive political forces. This is against the discourse of progress and against certain narratives of progress. So you kill the alternatives, you kill the criticism to capitalism, but you make a compromise with economic elites such that they're only talking to certain politicians in power, and with the idea that you don't really fundamentally undermine the economic system, but we just kind of come to extract concessions from them enough that you can give people something, but really without having a worry about democracy and democratic representation. And I think if this is familiar, it's because the pattern somehow repeats itself.
Just this weekend, very prominent lobby of the wealthy elites, the Familienunternehmer in Germany, they basically came out and told the leading conservative party, the ruling conservative party, to open themselves up to the German fascists, AfD.
Yeah, right.
Because they're afraid that any left-wing party would raise some small taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think this is the pattern everywhere, actually. So this is why fascism works in collusion with capitalist forces. It's not really an alternative. It's a compromise. It's a compromise that responds to the crisis of globalization and to a moment in the expansion of commercial forces that needs to be contained, but somehow is contained through the brute force of these political actors.
But the same pro-capitalist people always respond with, like, capitalism, democracy go hand in hand, and capitalism help democracy spread.
Yeah, well, that's what the capitalists would say. But for me, the problem there, it's not the capitalists, because of course the capitalists would say that they have their interests, they need to defend their interests, and they need to stay in power. Mm-hmm. For me, the problem is, why does the left, why do the social democrats also believe this? Mm-hmm. So the origins of the social democratic project were, social democracy in its inception was a kind of project that would actually overcome capitalism in the name of democracy. And the fact that now a number of mainstream social democratic parties also believe that it's possible to come to this, that capitalism is inherently democratic, that's where you have to look for responsibility. Yeah. It's not the capitalists. Of course they're going to do that. But why do people who are supposed to defend democracy also endorse this thesis that it's only capitalism that can give us democracy? That's more of a puzzle for me.
You don't know why?
So I think it's really complicated because there are a number of mechanisms. So some of them go via the way of preference adaptation and, again, sort of changes in the party structure, ways in which elite circulation functions. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it has to do with the cartelization of party politics in the last few decades, where parties are not really mass parties, and they're not really driven by ideological contestation, and they're not really driven by political narratives, and increasingly compete for the support of capital. And so there is a sense in which if you depend on capital for your existence, then there may be a limit to how much your discourse can actually be one that fundamentally confronts capitalism, as opposed to saying, why don't you just make some concessions, and why don't you just, if you're a little bit nice to us, we'll be a bit nicer to you. And so it becomes this much more charming way of thinking about politics. So a lot of it, I think, has to do with changes in representative democracy. A lot of it has to do with changes in social democracy, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so this idea that there is no alternative that's taken over, that's a remnant of in part the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, but also Thatcher-Reagan doctrine of neoliberalism, and again, the famous Thatcher saying there's no alternative. This is a thesis that I think a number of progressive social democratic actors in Europe and in Western countries have also endorsed. And if you think like that, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you act so that actually there is really no alternative.
But I wonder why they accepted this, because basically neoliberalism changed party politics on the left. The wall fell. Maybe they thought like, okay, I guess capitalism won. We were wrong. Let's go with something new.
I think it's a result of various things. So one is the post-war context, where social democracy meant that capital was much more willing to compromise with organized labor. Mm-hmm. And so, you had an expansion of the welfare state. Mm-hmm. And that meant that this created the illusion in social democratic parties that maybe we can actually contain this. Now, I think the question is, why did these capitalists make those concessions? Well, on the one hand, because the alternative was the Soviet Union. So there were also communist forces that didn't actually believe in a compromise between capitalism and democracy. And so thought, well, actually, we're going to have a complete radical alternative. So expropriation. And there is a possibility of doing things very, very differently that does not involve asking the capitalists if they can be a bit nicer. Mm-hmm. And this was constantly on the table for them, because if you think about the communist movement in the 60s and 70s, it was constantly a threat to also mainstream social democratic parties. That was this alternative that was even further to the left. So in 1989, when Cold War comes to an end, on the one hand, this idea that, there was an alternative system is just gone, because that alternative system has also itself turned in the other direction. So it's been sort of eroded from within. So the legitimacy of these systems is called into question. And we can also talk about what went wrong on that side. So what's the problem with state socialism? Mm-hmm. But this combination of, on the one hand, the collapse of state socialism and the transformation of including those former communist states, and you can also think about communist parties in Eastern Europe that themselves become centrist parties effectively. And so everyone is now accommodating this economic system that is considered to be the only game in town. And so we don't need to worry about it. On the one hand, and so I think it's different conversations that we need to have about parties in Eastern Europe, parties in Western Europe, and what this does to the world as a whole. But I think it's a combination of, on the one hand, the gains of the 60s of the social democratic movement, creating this illusion that actually it's possible maybe to compromise with capital. And on the other hand, the collapse of any alternatives and any ways of thinking about a post-capitalist or an alternative to capitalism world that is entrenched in the post-89. And that configuration is what means that the options and the exits possibilities shrink and you can't think of an alternative.
Let's go back to oligarchy and your philosophical view on it, because over the centuries we realized, okay, we need to limit political power via constitution, via democratic processes, because we realized, okay, this one guy, a king or some emperor or something, shouldn't have all the power, so we limit power, we spread it in some kind of system. Why have we so far not realized that since political power needs to be limited, that capital needs to be limited as well? Because in Germany, there's a saying, Kapital ist Macht. The more capital you have, the more power you have.
Yeah.
And everybody knows this.
Yeah.
Why haven't we gone this step?
Because,
I mean, of course, the capitalists themselves would never go for it, but that's a very logical step to take.
Yeah, I think because in a way, I think there's different answers. So one was that there is a discourse that says the process of commercial expansion, the process of capital development is one way in which we have limited the power of the church or the family or the monarchy or the constitutions that were these constitutions that lacked democratic legitimacy. So historically, the development of commercial society has been one force through which we have limited the power of these institutions that were unaccountable. And so there's the reason why there's a transition from mechanisms of legitimacy that appealed to the divine right of kings, for example, or that appealed to the power of the church. And so there's other ways of thinking about legitimacy that don't involve the subject, the modern subject. And so there's this sense in this historical narrative whereby a number of people would say, well, commercial society, the expansion of commercial society was an important element in the development of the modern subject somehow. So for a critique of that to emerge, you need to understand the limits of commercial society, and you need to have a critical analysis of what are the mechanisms in the development of capital that make it impossible to actually have democracy. Now, the old-fashioned Marxist critique, which is old-fashioned in some ways, but also very relevant in others, and I think still valid, is that the reason capitalism can't do that is that it's premised on an asymmetry in ownership. It's the premise of capital is that some people own the means of production and some people own of capitalism is some people own the means of production, some people own labor power. So I sell my labor for a living. Either I'm an owner of Meta, of a company, or I'm someone who has to work for that company. And this fundamental asymmetry in ownership makes it really hard to then have equal representation and equal democratic representation. So this is one of the standard critiques of capitalism. But without that critique, what else do you have? I mean, it's very hard to come up with an account that somehow shows you the limitations of this project, because the narrative that says, actually, capitalism is always emancipating, or this economic system that the markets will trickle down, they will produce opportunities, they will make everyone eventually will be included. The story that tells you that, with globalization, we have solved the problems of poverty, or we have less absolute deprivation and so on. Sure. All these narratives of the development of commercial society come with a story of what this does in terms of freedom and democracy. And I think to counter that story, you need an alternative account of what is it that is fundamentally problematic about capitalist development. And I think that's where the Marxist critique becomes really relevant. And that's where the socialist alternative becomes really important.
So what does a Marxist say? How can we limit capital the easiest way?
Well, one way is to think about changes in structures of ownership. So which is not to say that you shouldn't have private property, which is what people assume when they talk about socialism.
You mean means of production?
Well, yeah, in the big means of production, so critical infrastructure, for example, or not. I always make this joke, because it's not about chicken in your garden, that you have to have collective ownership of pencils and block notes and everything that there is a sense in which some property and some distribution of property is important. It's more about whether you start with private property and think that the public needs to be justified based on this premise of private property, or whether you think with the public interest and you start with the public standpoint and then you decide on certain limits of where accumulation has gone too far, or how you can prevent these concentrations of wealth. So it's more about changing the default and how you think about this default. And the problem with capitalism is the default is private property. And the problem with systems that accommodate capitalism is that they don't really challenge that premise.
But can you actually limit the accumulation of capital in capitalism? Or does the entire system implode?
So the taxation system, that's the one very obvious way in which you not only you can limit, but you also have done it, is via the taxation system. So you just decide that there are social goals in society as well that have to do with education, with provision of healthcare, with certain goals that aren't delivered by just this capitalist accumulation. So one of the standards, or that everyone accepts, is that you need limits. It's not that we, even now we have the state that builds roads. And so it's a question of extent and degree, and how far you go in that project. But of course we limit capital in many ways already. It's more about what are the goals in the name of which we limit capital. So right now, we limit capital when it's good to the development of capital. So we assume that the state needs to build roads and bridges, and certain things need to be taken over by public institutions. Or we assume that the state is in charge of making sure that contracts are respected, for example, so that actually capitalists can have transactions in a more efficiency-driven way. And for me, it's a question of, you can build on that discourse to say, well, if we accept limits on capital for this, then shouldn't we have a conversation around what are the desirable things that we want to have in society, and where we can actually have a much more expansive discourse on what we want to achieve with democracy and where we want it to go somehow.
I mean, you could also view it through the climate, the climate glasses, or you put on your glasses and think of the climate, because if you limit the accumulation of capital, you limit economic growth.
Right.
And economic growth is related to CO2 output, and we need to get this to zero. So people could make the argument, okay, like maybe overcoming capitalism would help us deliver absolutely. I also think, though, that it's really important not to think that the goals of nature and the climate are separate from the goals of humans. And so for me, it's really important to also integrate environmental discourse in this idea of what does it mean to have humans that have flourishing lives, and what does it mean. So for me, it's not about nature is there and we need to care for nature, and humans are here and they just do all these horrible things to nature. For me, it's about the humans as a species, and actually our own survival is at stake. And you don't need to actually reify nature and separate it, because all you have to do is think about future generations, and all you have to do is think about this species that was been going on for so many centuries. And it's in many ways important to think about the development also of this cross-generational project that it's not over when our lives are over. We care about our descendants, we care about future generations, we care about what remains of us, we care about our projects in a way. When we die, we die, and the only way in which we stay alive, well, unless you're religious, is to think of what happens to your legacy, what happens to your projects, what happens to your ideas. So this is why I'm saying it's, for me, really important not to conduct the environmental climate discourse in a way that completely separates it from the human and from a more human-centered perspective, but to try and integrate these two. Have you ever been, let's call it, more capitalistic than now?
I think I was when I was in Albania, yes, certainly. Even with all the kind of collapses and all the financial, I in part was the result of also the collapse of communism. And that experience has been really important for me in also thinking about the limits of state socialism and the limits of democratic planning with no democratic structures. So democratic planning is what it was called, right? This idea that you have planned economy, but without actually mechanisms of legitimacy, where a socialist planned economy then becomes just a project of like a party elite and party bureaucrats. And so I think there was also something to the critique of state socialism. And there have been moments in my life where, based on that critique of state socialism, I thought, well, maybe capitalism is a more viable alternative. But now I go to the point where I think both of them, both state socialism and market capitalism, undermine freedom and democracy in different ways, but they both undermine it. And so it's really important to think about alternatives.
I mean, when you probably talk about state socialism, we talk about socialistic dictatorships.
Yeah.
So how could this ever be an option for a leftist dictatorship? That's a right-wing thing, autocratic structures. Why was that an option for you?
Well, it was a historical option, so I don't think we can say that was not socialism.
But it wasn't freedom either.
It wasn't freedom either, exactly. So this is why I think it's really important.
And left should fight for freedom and equality.
Yes, absolutely.
Democracy.
But there was a critique of capitalism that shaped those societies, and I don't think we can say, what was it? It was this kind of monster. We need to understand why there were those projects that took that form. I think in part because the socialist tradition, or at least certain parts of the socialist tradition, didn't take seriously liberal freedom, so first generation freedom. So for me, the limits of state socialism is in its engagement with freedom and in its thinking that actually political freedom is not that important, it's just a result of economic freedom. And I think this has led to the entrenchment of these systems of representation where it was all done via the internal party structure and the internal party mechanism. But I think it comes from a lack of engagement with this question of freedom. And I do think that the socialist tradition also has something to account for there. I don't think we can exonerate. And I mean, it's very easy for the Western leftists to say what these people talked about wasn't really socialism because they lived their lives thinking it was socialism. And they called it socialism.
Right.
They invoked Marx and Engels. They read those texts. They are the same texts that the left reads and so on.
Sure. But was it a fucking dictatorship? From today's point of view, it sounds right wing.
Yeah, but there is never, an implementation of ideas that is perfect. So you have to think about where did the failures come from. And I don't think that the approach is to say, for me, the right approach is to engage with that history, both in its experimentation with alternative economic structures, with socialist markets, with alternative ways of thinking about gender, for example. So there were discourses in Eastern Europe and in these former communist societies, which on many fronts would be considered progressive now. So that's one thing. And the other thing is to be really trenchant in the criticism and to say, well, what did they lack? What did they do wrong? And where exactly did they fail? And I'm not sure we're having this conversation because a lot of the Western left thinks, well, I have nothing to learn from them. I don't need to feel responsible for it. I don't need to worry about it. I don't need to, why is it my problem that these systems failed? And I think that's wrong. That's mistaken. It's limited approach. So we need to engage with the failures of state socialism as we engage with the failures of market capitalism, but with an eye to how did they both, and for what reason did they both betray this aspiration to freedom that somehow shaped and characterized both of them in their ambitions? And I think they fail for different reasons, as I say, but they both fail.
Are there common failures of the capitalist system and the state socialistic system?
It's a good question. I suspect, in a sense, in both of them, there's this idea that the system is democratic, right? Because actually, the socialist societies also called themselves democratic, interestingly. In fact, they often use the word democracy more than capitalist societies. I think there is a failure of understanding and of really coming to an awareness of what and how demanding democracy is as an ideal. I think the kinds of failures are different. So in the case of capitalist societies, the failures, the type of oppression that they manifest is more like a horizontal oppression because it's oppression by the market. In the case of state socialists, it's more vertical oppression because oppression by the state, by the party, the state structure. So it has a different axis. But they are both types of unfreedom, and we need to understand, why they are types of unfreedom and what can be done to think about alternatives that overcome the limits of both. And I think alternatives only emerge when you take the failures seriously on both fronts. So, yeah.
what could be socialist ideas of freedom?
I think it's so socialist ideas.
Modern ideas. Yeah.
Well, I always say socialism is liberalism minus capitalism. So
I like that.
That's a socialist idea of freedom. Is one that takes seriously freedom, both first generation, so political freedom, freedom of manifestation, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, freedom of political representation, but then also takes seriously the unfreedom of the market and therefore tries to overcome capitalism. And
no freedom to become a self-made billionaire?
I don't think any billionaire is ever self-made, actually, right? So this is, again, another flaw in our thinking, that we think that people are self-made. I mean, none of us is self-made. We are always a result of other people, either because they've invested in our education or they thought they made us help, either at a very individual level, so we're the result of what our families do with us, or we're the result of education systems or societies in which we live, or we're the result of fortunate coincidences, or we're actually the result of labor and other people who have worked to bring us where we are. So I don't think this is a very unilateral and impoverished way of thinking about the human, that there can ever be a self-made human, because every human is the result of the work of other humans.
But back to the socialist ideas of freedom. I mean, liberalism minus capitalism is a nice slogan, but we need to go or dig a little deeper.
Yeah, but the slogan tells you a lot of what you need to do. You need to preserve systems of liberal representation while working to overcome systems of capitalist entrenchment of property and economic structures.
But it's easy to, as an academic like you, to say liberalism minus capitalism, because you seem to understand what you're talking about with these words.
Yeah.
But like most people, laymen, they all have different ideas of what you mean by liberalism, or even probably by capitalism.
Well, what I mean by liberalism is, as I said, these first generation freedoms, so the kinds of freedoms that are associated to liberal democracy.
Like what? Like, give us an example.
Freedom to vote, freedom to associate, freedom to move, freedom to express yourself, freedom to articulate your political opinions, freedom of speech. All these, what are called the first generation, they're also sometimes called negative freedoms, right? So that's really important, and that's the kind of thing that was actually missing in state socialist societies, where you didn't have freedom of speech and you didn't have freedom to vote, really, because you had very restricted. People just went, and voting was a performative thing. So all the kinds of first-generation freedoms that were missing in a state socialist society, combined with control over the economy that comes from democratic organization. And so that can take the level of the firm, can take the level of thinking about education and care and looking after the elderly. And so a way of reorganizing society so that you have solidarity principles rather than a profit motive that drives forward economic development. All of this is, I mean, a philosopher can only give you the principles and then how the policies work. But actually, there are a lot of policies out there, because leftist parties, the only thing they've been doing in the last few decades is come up with one policy after another, and without really thinking about the fact that they needed narratives, that those socialist policies or egalitarian policies need political narratives to be driven forward. And the political narrative is given by the critique of capitalism. And so I don't think there is a kind of shortage of proposals out there on how you can tax wealth at the transnational level, or how you can put constraints on capital, or how you can develop European institutions in such a way as to provide for social justice. I mean, there's decades of work that have been done on any of these dimensions. What is missing is what can bring together all these policies with a political platform that says it's really important to understand that the critique of capitalism is fundamental to driving forward this kind of politics. Yeah.
I mean, you said like in state socialist societies, the first generation of freedoms were missing. Maybe they were omitted.
They were?
Omitted, like they were purposely left out. I mean,
they weren't left out, because even in communist Albania, people could vote, and they could also not vote, but then there were consequences. But it's not that clearly the principle of voting was important. It's not that anyone abolished elections.
Right. I mean, even in Russia today, they vote.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right, absolutely. So I think, but it's important that, I think for me, it's a sign of progress that people think that this is an important principle, that we can't do away with this idea that we vote, right? And then it's a question of taking it seriously and making sure that you can then also guarantee the other things that are there that are required to make sure that actually voting is meaningful, for example, right?
But then again, like, I think there's a German saying, like, if voting would ever change anything, it would be illegal.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we should...
It's a little cynical.
Yeah, I don't think we should completely, because I think if you also lose the vote, I mean, it would be, I'm sure a lot of anti-democrats and fascists out there would be very happy to see the votes done away with or return to the principles of voting by wealth, for example, which is actually incidentally what some of them have been advocating. You know, the recent turn in these tech oligarchs discussions is that democracy is not really needed for capitalism, that actually monarchy is perfect, and people like Peter Thiel and so on. There have been a lot of returns to this conservative pre-modern understanding of power because they figured out that actually maybe for stabilizing certain capitalist patterns, it's better to not have democracy because there is some, it's true, voting is a very limited power, but it is a kind of power. And
right.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, like, maybe if we take a historical viewpoint on oligarchy, because like we discussed that the oligarchs try to tell their subjects or the people that they live in a democracy. So these people think they live in a democracy.
Yeah, right.
And they see how the system is failing them.
Yeah.
You know, compared to what was promised. How do we know that maybe many people would favor another system? Because like, okay, this kind of democracy, which is not a democracy, is failing them. So maybe they would call for, you know, going back to monarchy.
Yeah, that's what they're doing now.
Or dictatorship.
Right. So that's what they're doing now. I think there's a point where even this limited democracy is an obstacle to the full realization of their interests. And so that's why what we experience now is actually also clamped down on democracy. So it's not enough that the discourse that says, the earlier one that you were saying, you know, the oligarch says actually we live in a democracy, but they know we don't really live in a democracy. And then you get the next stage, which is they don't need to say we live in a democracy anymore. In fact, what they say is democracy is an obstacle. And what we need is to just make sure that we have free hand. And that's what is now often articulated in the US.
Yeah, as in like minorities having the right to vote. Women.
Right, absolutely, exactly. Yeah, it's a kind of anti-democratic thinking that becomes mainstream as well. And that leads to, because they think, you know, democracy somehow also undermines, especially if it's driven by progressive narratives, especially if these projects that are about affirming some social rights or economic rights or rights for migrants, rights for people who are excluded from the public sphere. That's when it becomes a kind of obstacle. And yeah.
It's kind of crazy that many people like the idea of bringing back monarchy, even in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no, it's quite concerning, right? And somehow we think that this is just these crazy people that are doing crazy things, but in a way, it's perfectly compatible with this system that needs to develop without interference with it. And so if the idea is that I'm committed, I know what I'm doing, I'm developing technology, I'm developing AI, I know what I need, I know what society needs to develop, and everything that comes and articulates an alternative way of thinking is actually preventing me from realizing the goals that I think is what society needs. That's where you then get this anti-democratic moment.
I don't feel like the big players who are developing AI are interested in what society needs. They seem to be interested in what they themselves or corporation need.
Yeah, but they think a corporation is an important unit in the development of society. It's not that they have no altruistic thinking whatsoever. I mean, all this stuff about effective altruism and all the stuff about thinking about future generations, it's all take the form of technological development, usually some kind of techno-futurist or techno-utopian futurist project, which is about I need to develop these alternative ways of thinking and the alternative technologies that come with it. And I think it is I don't think they're just saying it's just for self-serving purposes. I mean, of course, it also serves their interests, but it's a kind of narrative that justifies self-interest based on what they think society needs.
I mean, they seem to develop AI, so they need less human beings
Right.
As workforce.
Yeah, right. But they also think that the wealth generated by AI will trickle down in such a way that it will. I mean, I'm not on their side politically. I'm just kind of going back to, I'm sort of trying to articulate what that alternative discourse to make the point that without the critique of capitalism, this is what you need to explain what are the limits of that project, what are the shortcomings. This is why it's important to recover the critique of capitalism so that it doesn't become just these kind of crazy people who say these crazy things, and to explain that there is a coherence to that discourse. It's just a coherence that any capitalist who wants to justify a capitalist economic system will bring forward. And if you want to undermine it, then you need to engage with the narrative, not with the kind of crazy ad hoc nature of these statements, right?
Have people called you crazy?
No, I'm not sure. No, I don't think so. No. I mean, maybe they have behind my backs, I'm sure. Actually, maybe my trolls called me crazy. I'm not even sure they called me crazy. Maybe more.
I mean, like the professional and academics, because
no,
especially in Great Britain.
No, I think I'm a very reasonable person. Everyone agrees when I say things.
You have a minority position at the London School of Economics. I mean,
I'm not sure, actually. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think a lot of people see the limits of capitalism, and
even
maybe
at
they
LSE?
think, even at LSE, certainly. It's just that, in fact, I think there is a kind of pessimism around anti-capitalist politics. But I don't think the problem is at the level of philosophical argument against capitalism. So I think in that level, a lot of people actually agree. It's more that then, when you move from this philosophical discussion of the limits of capitalism or moral critique of capitalism, or however you want to define it, to the what should we do, how do we think about politics, that's where the skepticism and the pessimism and the cynicism and the apathy kicks in. But that's at the level of kind of calling a view crazy, I'm not so sure. I think people see that it's not. If I say we need a European federalist socialist society, that sounds good, right?
For some, that's crazy.
Well, I mean, then they have to say why.
I know.
They have to explain.
Going back to the philosophical idea of democracy, or like liberal democracy in the West. I mean, Churchill, I think, once said, like, okay, democracy is a bad system, but the best one we have.
Yeah, except for all the others. Yeah,
exactly. And many of my guests here, like from the political spectrum, they would basically say liberal democracy is the best there is. That there cannot be a better political system. Yeah. Do you agree?
No, I would distinguish between liberal representation and liberal democracy.
Explain.
I think we have liberal representation, but I'm not sure we even have liberal democracy. I mean, then maybe it becomes terminological. I think liberal democracy is a society where democracy is robustly guaranteed across kind of counterfactuals, where democracy really works and where democracy is sort of solid somehow and is not vulnerable to these fluctuations that we have just been talking about and that we have been experiencing and witnessing politically in the last few years, right? So where democracy is sort of so entrenched in legal and political institutions that these principles of democratic representation are actually really taken seriously. Now, first of all, in the economic sphere, it's not the case that liberal democracy has democracy. And on the other hand, as I say, if you don't have democracy in the economic sphere, it's not really clear that you also have political democracy because you have this power of the few with wealth and power to shape political discourse. So I would say we have liberal representation in the sense of the principle of one person, one vote is constitutionally guaranteed, and it's there, and there are elections, and there is a multi-party system, and people turn up and vote for the party that they think should be come to power. That's liberal representation. But democracy is much more demanding, I think, and I'm not really sure that we have liberal democracy.
What I'm always wondering, like, there's, of course, a reason why we have representation, because unlike 2,000 years or 3,000 years ago in good old Greek Athens, where, okay, every slave owner came together and they decided once a week on a law. So it was easy kind of democracy. But like when you have millions and millions of people in a country, they can come together every week and vote on the laws that govern them. So of course, there needed to be like some kind of way to manage this.
Yeah.
And like, okay, let's say 100,000 people are represented by one member of parliament.
Yeah.
So that was the way to go, because there was no other way to organize this.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you still need that even in a post-capitalist society.
But like, like nowadays in the 21st century, like especially now, we don't have this problem anymore.
The problem of scale.
Yeah, because
Why?
like we don't. Of course, there can't be 80 million Germans in front of our parliament every week, but we have technology to overcome this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't think the problem of scale is just a problem of numbers. I think it's also about coherence around alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
So what a party does, it gives you a set of a kind of vision that brings together people that share this vision for change of society, for example. So I don't think the party system and the representative system only is there just to solve the problem of scale and just so that, 100,000 people can be represented by one person. And in fact, it's not just a principle of the one person that represents the 100,000 that is doing the work in a liberal representative system. It's the idea that those 100,000 are coming together around some sense of how they want society to change. So if you're a Christian Democrat, you have a Christian democratic vision. If you're a social democrat, you have a social democratic vision. If you're a green, you have a green vision, and so on. I mean, in capitalism, I think all of that becomes irrelevant because the primary motive of the economy is the motive of profit. And since that is not being discussed, then I think all these alternatives, they become minor tweaks of policy within a dominant framework that nobody really challenges. Mm-hmm. And so, but the principle itself of liberal representation, I think, is a really important principle. So I think in a socialist society, you would have the same. You would have a multi-party system and you would have a default that is different. And so where you have a political structure that relates to the economic structure in a different way, where it's not all about profit, it's also about solidarity, care, and social needs and democratic demands that trump this motive of profit. But then how you organize opinion and how you feed into processes of public opinion formation will also need some principle of liberal representation. So you could have a socialist constitution, and then you could have lots of different parties, each of which gives you some understanding of what should we do now when it comes to policy to implement the goals of this socialist constitution, for example, right? So this is why I don't think it's incompatible. Socialism is not incompatible with liberal representation. In fact, I think it's required, and you need this idea of liberal representation to solve all these kinds of questions that we've been talking about. And I don't know that technology just gives you the answer, because you also need mechanisms
it's a tool.
Exactly, it's a tool, but you also need mechanisms of discussion around, what is our shared vision? What do we agree? Are we more green socialists, or are we more feminist socialists, or are we more... So I think for that you need some sense of, as I say, representation that's a group-based representation as well.
So your idea of like a socialist society, a state, is it still a system of domination?
Well, it's system insofar as you need the law and you need coercion.
Right.
In some ways, yes, it's a system in which laws are made and you need the law to realize certain social goals. So then it depends on how dominating or not dominating the law is, depends on how you justify, and so how much democracy there is then at the basis of lawmaking.
Right.
But it's true that there is also a critique, which I'm very sympathetic to, which says that if you actually have real democracy, maybe you don't need the law, because people comply without needing these coercive structures.
Right.
And so,
let's break it down to like a dynamic between us. If we were friends, right? That would we wouldn't have like a system of domination. Like I wouldn't dominate you, you wouldn't dominate me.
Mm-hmm.
We would be an egalitarian principle.
Right.
So, and we could still have or give ourselves rules.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this friendship based on these rules, and we don't betray this, and we can do this and all this.
Yeah.
Without having a system of domination. That's why I was asking. Like,
I think even in a friendship you can have dynamics of domination, right? So one of us is more articulate than the other, and so when they explain why should we do this, one of us speaks better, and so convinces.
It's a circumstantial. It's a circumstantial domination.
Yeah.
Unlike the political system.
Right. Yeah. But I think, in the case of the political system, domination is more or less tamed. So it can be contained more or less. I think some element of, as I say, I think the law always dominates. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a coercive structure, if you have, a system that tells you, like, if you break the law, you get fined, that it's unavoidable, that there is a pattern there that's there's something other than your will that is kicking in when you're deciding what to do, basically. But I think a world that is completely free from domination, this is more like a kind of communist utopia, right? This idea that the state has kind of withered away.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with it as an ideal. It's more that you can't really theorize that. What you can theorize is how to... you can theorize to have more democratic accountability within a legal system.
Right.
I don't really know that we have precedents or that we can think of. But I don't have a problem with the vision. It's more that it's something that there's a reason for why when Marx was trying to write about what communism consists of, he writes about, fishing in the morning and hunting in the afternoon and criticizing in the evening, because you can't be that specific about what exactly a society free from domination looks like.
Right.
Because it's the result of people who try to overcome these patterns of domination. And so you can't really prescribe it or say from the top what it's going to look like and so on.
No, it's almost impossible to imagine it, but we can state that we have the tools to achieve it.
I think we have the tools now to have more democracy that is legally entrenched. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that we have yet the tools, because I think the tools to overcome domination at this level aren't just economic and legal, they're also social. So it's also about social expectations, about ways of, a lot of it is about changes in human nature and, developing altruistic dispositions, developing certain ways of relating to people that are so different because we have been brought up in completely different circumstances that it's really hard. But I like it. I don't have a problem with it. It's just that I think I wouldn't say that we already have the tools somehow. So
I just thought of like we have the tools that the masters gave us, and we can use the very same tools to burn down the house.
We can use them to make power more justified, but I don't think yet we can use them to completely get rid of any need for power.
Well, maybe not yet, but maybe
coercive structures.
Maybe in a few years.
Well, more like a few centuries, but
Right, but no. In my head, it's like, okay, almost every human being in the world has a phone.
Yeah.
So let's do something with this.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right, but I think there is a difference.
Every human being can easily be connected. Like if I want to talk to someone in Bangladesh, there's a way of me talking to that person, or in Australia, or in Malawi, or something.
Yeah, so I think we have the tools to, as I say, overcome unilateral uses of power and to make power more justified and to have kind of more collective power. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a difference because we started by talking about domination, and maybe I understand it in a much more specific way. Mm-hmm. But for me, overcoming domination means overcoming the need for power, and that includes social power.
Yes.
And so that I think is a little bit harder and more demanding. And I don't have a problem with it. I just think like we have to solve so many other things before there. That's a nice idea to hold on to, but it's I
remember the scientist who said it, but like I think he was like the only laws that dominate mankind are the laws of nature.
Yeah, and maybe even those we have tools now with development technology and scientific development and so on. But that's what a lot of the tech people would also tell you. So that's kind of taking it into a more techno-socialist utopian direction.
So back to you going to Italy after school, and you studied philosophy and political theory. What kind of philosophers or political theorists interested you the most?
I think I started working on Kant and was really interested in Kant, and actually also in German idealism more generally, and maybe also as a result of that in the Marxist tradition. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the philosopher that I've been most interested in as one sort of single philosopher throughout my life is Kant.
Because of universalism or...
I think it's interesting. There's a sort of biographical answer to this question and a more philosophical answer. Mm-hmm. So the biographical answer is the biographical answer is, I think when I came out of Albania in 97, after this having gone through first the collapse of communism, then the collapse of the pyramid schemes, I somehow needed some anchoring in a philosophical tradition and in a philosophical system that for me was able to give me both a critical view of society, but without leaving me completely pessimistic about, because you can be too critical and then feel paralyzed in how you think about action and how you think about the future and so on. And what I really liked about the Kantian philosophy is that it has there's two, as Kant says, there's two dangers. One is skepticism and one is dogmatism. And I think the Kantian philosophy gave me some kind of grounding and a sense in which you could be critical of dogmatism and of authority and authoritarianism, but that being critical of everything doesn't mean that you then end up a skeptic, and that you need some sense of faith and some idea that projects continue, and a critique of society that makes it feasible for you or possible for you to think that there is this other way of relating to people that's not skeptical and not cynical. And I think, yeah, that was a kind of anti-skeptic element, this what Kantian philosophers call practical reason, or this sort of faith in practical reason, I suppose, is a more philosophical way of saying it. But that's why I was always interested. I was also really interested in Kant's critique of, or Kant's understanding of the Enlightenment as a kind of critical philosophy. Again, there's a lot of trashing of the Enlightenment these days, and the Enlightenment is often connected to imperialism and colonialism and liberalism and so on. But I think at its inception, Enlightenment was a very subversive project, because it was about critiques of authority and about education and knowledge and the development of humans in such a way that they would become their own masters again. So going back to this idea of fighting domination is actually really attractive. And I think the root of it is all in this Enlightenment philosophy.
What would Kant say to a world without domination? Or could he ever imagine that?
I mean, Kant has a sort of more utopian element in when he comes, for example, when he writes about perpetual peace. So he thinks of a world where states will not fight each other at all anymore. And so this is like an ideal of perpetual peace that seems to be like a world without at least that level of domination, right? Where you need to fight wars to solve problems.
Exactly.
And Kant says that we can have a vision of a cosmopolitan society where we don't fight wars anymore. And we, in fact, make it impossible to fight wars because states commit to no longer fighting. You know, the first article of perpetual peace for Kant is "There shall be no war." And then he goes on to elaborate on what this means, including in terms of saying how devastating war is and how war relates to commercial development and how states have to kind of indebt themselves to fight wars. And I think there is a sort of, maybe this dimension of utopianism, if you want to call it that, in at least this element of Kant's thought in perpetual peace.
Did he think about democracy and oligarchy? Since we talked about this.
Yeah, so this is more open to controversies, and I don't think the resources are all in Kant. I have a reading of Kant that's more radical, that makes it compatible with saying certain things about property, for example. But not all Kant scholars would agree with that. But I do think that in Kant, the justification of property is really important. And what's also really important is the critique of alternatives, what we might call Lockean alternatives to think about property. So Locke thought that the state is justified based on the protection of individual property. So we need to guarantee individual property, and then what makes political structures justified is the fact, and this is a more standard liberal capitalist story, right? You start with private property and then you justify political structure. So Kant did not have that. He had a very different way of thinking about property. He thought that property is actually something, the guarantee of which places people under obligations to respect each other somehow. And for that reason, you can't have private property before you have a system of scrutiny of the limits of property. So he thought that what he calls private property, private right is where you discuss private property. So private right, public right, international right, and then what he calls cosmopolitan right, which is the right of all the people of the earth to come together, are interconnected and interdependent, such that if one of them is missing, the whole system collapses. So you can't really have, for him, private property in a world in which you don't have cosmopolitan right. That's why I think the justification, and this is where I kind of draw my interpretation that's more radical, because if you don't start with the idea that we have justified private property and then everything else needs to be built on this, and you start the other way around. You start with this cosmopolitan Enlightenment standpoint about relations between humans that are universal across space and across time, and then think about property within that. This is a very different apparatus, different way of thinking, and I think there are radical implications of that way of reading Kant for contemporary politics and for the critique of capitalism, for everything. But not all the resources are in Kant, so I wouldn't want to kind of overdo it and say Kant was, he had a great critique of capitalism and it's already all there and so on. He didn't.
But you've never abandoned Kant.
No, I didn't, because I think it gives me philosophically certain tools, and I then combine it with political economy, with Marxist tradition, with a way of reading and thinking about capitalism. And I mean, I don't think with any of these philosophers that there's one philosopher that will give you the answer to all the problems of the world. That also, incidentally, doesn't apply to Marx either, because there are lots of things that Marx and the Marxist tradition could think about and solve, but there's a lot of other things that they haven't thought about because just they were philosophers of a particular time and place. So I think of them as giants on whose shoulders we sit and do our thinking for ourselves and think about the future with resources that we take from all these different traditions. And then we use them to think about crises and how we could overcome them.
How come that Kant and later Marx and other philosophers, they actually came up seemingly with new ideas and new ways of thinking about the world? Where are these philosophers nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think they had a more systematic way of thinking because the kind of world in which they lived was much more unified somehow. Mm-hmm. So there was more unified theory because there was less fragmentation in society, mm-hmm. in part because these were societies that were emerging from, religious systems or from monarchical systems. And mm-hmm. so there was a much more kind of top-down way of thinking, and therefore knowledge also worked in that way. And the kind of societies in which we live are much more fragmented. And so also knowledge is more fragmented. And it's really hard to come up with, systems of the kind that these 19th century philosophers came up with. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because part of democracy is also that you don't already have all the answers. So what you need is you need to have a critique of society, and you need to have certain ideas of in what direction you want those critiques to move forward, and you need to have deliberation and debate and the possibility of exchanging views on what are the limitations of existing frameworks and how we need new frameworks and so on. But I don't necessarily think that we need one philosophical system that fixes the world in a way that would not be very democratic either. So I think you just need coherent critiques of society and a way of deciding what's more plausible and less plausible. So you need a sense of reason that does the work there. And you need also to understand the limitations of a framework that says, it's all relative. There's no way of telling right from wrong. And it's like, I say this, you say this. We just, each of these views is the same as the other. And I think this is where reasoning becomes really important. And that's also why I think the Enlightenment was really important, because it was this kind of project mm-hmm. that enabled people to think about education and public sphere and coming together and opinion formation, mechanisms of opinion formation, where you ask yourself the question of what are preferences that are formed in reasonable ways and what are preferences that are formed under manipulative conditions. What is the role of propaganda in fostering consent? I mean, all these kinds of questions that we still ask now.
Right.
You do need criteria for deciding and for having debate around these all of these dimensions. So I don't think full relativism is plausible or desirable on this front. And actually, I don't think real democracy is fully relativistic in that sense.
It's funny, I mentioned Chomsky earlier with manufacturing consent, and I learned from him, especially capitalistic free societies need necessary illusions mm-hmm. to survive, or that the elites make sure to never question. How, especially capitalism, free markets, all this.
Well, I think what they need is a very shallow idea of freedom, mm-hmm. including freedom of speech, for example. Yeah. So they need a very shallow idea that everything I say, but now we also understand the limits of that, right? Because if you think about social media and ways in which views are formed on social media, where you don't really ask yourself the question of coherence or consistency, or you have this mechanisms of expression of which are on the surface, it's all freedom of speech and freedom of opinion. But then now we also understand the limits of that, and we understand what it means to have freedom of speech without education, for example. But I do think that, to go back to your question, capitalism does rely on this very shallow understanding of freedom as negative freedom, just like being left alone to do whatever you think, and just no institution, no authority, no structure can tell you what is more reasonable and what's less reasonable ways of thinking about speech and so on.
So, do we know if Marx had read Kant?
I think he had read Kant, because there is a letter from the young Marx to his father when he was studying, when he was like an 18 or 19-year-old. And I think there is in that letter some indication that he'd been reading all this like.
Hi, Dad, I'm a Kantian now.
Well, I can't remember now exactly how it is, but there's that's usually the evidence that people would go to. But I think also Marx eventually. I mean, that also, a lot of Kant was filtered through German idealism. So he would have definitely read Kant, because all the German idealists read Kant. Hegel had read Kant. A lot of Hegel's philosophy engages with Kant. Mm-hmm. A lot of Marx's philosophy is engaging with Hegel. So I think this was very much part of what every intellectual was discussing and debating around then. But I think the young Marx was much more into these philosophical conversations, and then became more interested in political economy and in the critique of capitalism that took a more empirical direction. So then when he writes, so this the young Marx is very much Hegelian and also engaged in these kind of German idealist discussions. And then the later Marx becomes much more about the critique of capital and develops the thinking in a different direction. And there's a lot of debate among Marx scholars on the extent to which the young Marx and the old Marx are the same, or the extent to which the older Marx is abandoned the young Marx and all this stuff. So,
did you at school or at college? Did you have to read other philosophies as well and critique them?
You mean in university?
Yeah,
so in school we didn't do any philosophy.
Of course, but
because
at
actually,
university?
At the point in which I was going to school, people used to do Marxism, and so they would read some. I guess they would have read German ideology. My mom would have read German ideology. Everybody was forced to read certain texts. But then when I was going to school, they were all abolished, because the regime had changed, and so there was no Marxism, and actually there was no philosophy in school.
You got Hayek and Popper.
So we got Hayek and Popper. We didn't get it in school, but they were very much like the kinds of texts that were translated and published. So they were there somehow if you wanted to. And I had read. I was sort of interested, as everyone was in Albania back in those days. And so then in university, I mean, we did the whole philosophical canon, like Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Rousseau, Constant, Gramsci, German kind of Frankfurt School critical theory, then later on Rawls, liberal egalitarianism. So
what do you teach your students nowadays?
Well, it depends. So when I teach history of philosophy, I usually teach Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Kant, Rousseau, the kind of classics of political thought. Yeah. Okay. And when I teach Marx and Marxism, then I teach basically not just Marx and Engels, but also Bernstein, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, contemporary Marxist, analytical Marxists, so John Romer, Jerry Cohen, Habermas, sort of critical theory type takes on Marxism, Habermas, Honneth, what else? Rahel Yegi, Rainer Forst, this more like latest generations. I'd say.
How old are your students?
They're anything from 18 to 24, 25, 26.
Do you talk to them? They're probably mostly British students, or
no? Actually, at the LSE they're very international.
Okay.
So they're from all over the place. And in fact, in one of my master's classes recently, incidentally, the one on Marx, I think only 2 people in class were British, and the rest were from all over Europe and the world.
Do you guys talk about let's say the British political scene, what's happening?
Well, I mean, I think with this environment, you have to talk about everywhere. So it's not because students who have come to study in Britain, they don't necessarily know the British political system as well. I mean, so the English students will know and the British students will know. But if they're German or French, they know more about their own countries. And so we discuss across the range. I have a lot of Chinese students. We talk about China and Korean, Japanese, we have Indian.
Are the Chinese students, can they be honest? Can they speak freely?
I think eventually, yeah. It's interesting when you teach Marx, actually, because and a lot of Chinese students take my Marx classes. And it's interesting because they obviously teach Marx in China.
At school, probably.
At school and university. And actually, if you get their university records, also even when they apply for PhDs, you can see they've taken a lot of exams in Marxism. but then they also get exposed to a different kind of way of thinking about Marxism at the LSE. And so, I suppose it's a Marxism that's more that's more of a liberal Marx, let's say. But now I think things are also changing in China. So it varies different year on year. Things are changing.
Is there an autocratic Marx in China?
I'm not sure that my Chinese students would tell me that, or that they could tell me that. I mean, there is a more traditional interpretation, or more kind of orthodox, let's call it a more orthodox Marxist interpretation, which is much more about this later Marx that we've been talking about, the Marx of capital, as opposed to the Marx that discusses philosophical ideas. So it's much more sort of maybe deterministic and more. But there's a sort of more orthodox reading of historical materialism that I think is the one that they've been most exposed to. And so they're really interested then if you're comparing Marx with Rawls, or if you're putting it together with a liberal egalitarian tradition, or with critical theory, or. But it's also really nice because it goes both ways. They can tell you, they come with resources, so they are already. They've read the text, they know a lot about the text, and it's very nice when they actually get to talk about what they know and what they discover, and it's really interesting discussions.
Do you see a difference of your students nowadays than compared when you started as a professor? Like from their behavior, from their political views? So
I started at the LSE and I started teaching Marx, and I've seen increased interest in Marx. So this is one difference that I've noticed, is that this was when I started my job, a small course. And now it's a really large course, and lots of people want to take it, and there's real demand for it. And maybe also other colleagues, and also demands for doing PhDs, and thinking about...
Do you make more money if you have more students?
No, but fortunately not.
But more work?
No, I mean, there's ways in which we organize work, so you maybe do a little bit more with teaching and less with other things. So it's... I think it's even. But fortunately, university is not as commodified yet as to make more money if you get more students. But it might be at some point, so I don't know.
So when you're a professor in Great Britain, are you a professor for life?
Yeah, pretty much, so far. I mean, this was the case also in the US until recently, and now we're seeing professors being kicked out by universities. So I don't know what for life means. But
would you consider leaving Great Britain, like if Farage or some very, very right-winger get into power?
I'm not sure. I mean, this question is probably going to be irrelevant because they'll kick me out before I think about leaving, or I would leave if I think that they're about to kick me out.
You're a British citizen, right?
Yeah, but I think these anti-migrant movements, I don't think there's a limit to when they start with these exclusion waves, that the being of citizen, naturalized citizen. I mean, I'm not born, I speak with an accent. So I don't think that these differences will matter if those projects become radicalized and really take over as they have started already. Now it's all about illegal migrants and, people who have committed crimes and so on. But if the anti-migrant discourse continues in society, I'm sure people like me are next in line. So I'd probably leave when I felt that I'm about to be kicked out.
I mean, basically, we've been talking about the crisis of the left for 90 minutes already. But since you mentioned them, migrants and anti-migrant narratives, why does the left chase these right-wing narratives anyway?
Because I think the left has made the answer to the problems of capitalism dependent on membership in the nation state. And so because the answer is membership, exclusion is a solution. And that's for the right in a much more obvious way, and for the left in a way that tinkers with the margins of a discourse that is more or less framed by the right. So the right says, look, there's globalization, there's a problem of globalization. And the reason there are these problems has to do with membership and with nation states and with who belongs and who doesn't. So, it's about migrants that undermine the way the state works, or that undermine liberal values, or however this narrative shows up in the right. And I think the state, the left, in part because of the limitations of both state socialism and social democracy, both of which were wedded to the nation state in their distinctive ways. So in the state socialist version, it was wedded to the nation state because of the planned economy and the way in which economic systems worked. In the case of the social democratic left, so the Western left, it wasn't wedded to the nation state because emancipation came from social justice and rule of law and a system of rights that was basically entrenched in the nation state. I think the left has lost its transnational dimension. And so it has lost the kind of transnational critique of capitalism. and a critique that is not membership-based, or a critique that might take, for example, a class dimension, where you say the axis of conflict aren't really about states, but are about different social classes, and they play out differently in different states. So it's not really about geopolitical conflict. It's not really about conflict based on membership, but it's about social, economic, and political conflicts that are driven by the development of capitalism. And I think the left has sort of lost, I mean, for the most part, has lost this kind of critique.
How can you lose this?
Well, I mean, I think we just said from the way in which the left has developed in the 20th century. So it started with the transnational critique of capitalism.
Right.
This was very much the first international project. You know, it was an internationalist project. There was different parties. They all had a coordinated agenda. They had a coordinated critique. And so this was the first international. Then in the second international, you had a little bit of that. And then with the third international, it just goes out of the window because, as I say, in the former communist bloc, it becomes, the third international is a kind of Trotskyist international. So it becomes a very niche, narrow way of understanding what the international is. But basically, the left becomes either a state socialist left in Eastern Europe, or it becomes a social democratic left. In both cases, it's wedded to the nation state. And so where the nation state or where membership is seen as the solution, it turns into a question of who belongs and who doesn't. And there, the discourse is framed by the right, because if it's about who belongs and who doesn't, the right has a much more coherent narrative of, civilizational conflict or religious conflict or cultural conflict. So it can explain all the conflicts of the world with reference to identity one way or another. And it's not clear that the left has kind of gone beyond that, thinking about identity and recovering real universalism.
So shouldn't the left ask who belongs and who doesn't, or should they give a new answer?
Well, the answer should be that under capitalism, this is a completely fake and false problem. Because actually under capitalism, so this question of who belongs and who doesn't is a question of borders, right? So who is in the border, who is out of the border, and when it comes to migration. And it's very easy for the left to point out that under capitalist conditions, borders are always open if you're very rich and always closed if you're very poor. And then in between, it depends on how close or far you are from either of these things. But basically, if you don't start with the problem is capitalism rather than membership, then someone who starts with membership has the advantage because they've already framed the narrative in such a way that you're always playing catch. So I think it's not that the left shouldn't at all talk about who belongs and who doesn't. It's more that this question of belonging needs to be turned against the capitalist system to show that actually the right, who is now talking about belonging, it's never been easier for oligarchs to get citizenship. And so if you look at changes, I don't know how it is in Germany, but in a number of other countries, the transformations in citizenship practice over the last few years have been such that citizenship has become really hard for the poor, the people with no resources, with no rights, with even to get their families. For example, family reunification, which used to be relatively easy, has now become completely impossible if you don't have the resources and the means, on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you are a millionaire who can show that they're going to invest, you get citizenship with either accelerated or right away, or so you get this proliferation of what's called golden visas and golden citizenship by investment. So what we see is in the current stage of capitalist development, you have this transformation of citizenship whereby citizenship depends on property again. And this is what it was in the 19th century. So remember that when the Democrats were concerned that there was not real representation, it was citizenship based on census. So only rich people could vote and only rich people had representation and everybody else was excluded. And what you have now is the same. You have the citizenship that depends on money and property and qualifications. And the right is reinforcing that trend. So this question of who belongs and who doesn't, it can be framed in so many different ways, and you can talk about it within a framework that brings together the analysis of capitalism with the analysis of the nation state with the critique of the right. It's just that the left is not doing that because it's playing catch, and so it's not really taking on its own terms with also with this discussion around citizenship and migration.
Yeah, I'm reading up right now on the American Revolution, 1775, and when they drafted their Declaration of Independence, and their Congress was all about
no taxation without representation.
But like they formed some kind of democratic system, but it was all about property owning man.
Yeah, right.
And not only property owning, but like human being owning men.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
Slavers.
In the US, of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. So in the US, there's a discourse in the US as well. There's different debates also around that sort of time.
And the founding fathers were heavily against, like, no women voting.
Yeah, no, exactly, absolutely. But then, there were also debates within that, because this idea of representation and universalism and equality and freedom, and so that was in many ways also connected to the Enlightenment and to the development of these discussions.
Right.
It could then be contested as well. But I think, this idea that citizenship was based on property and on census, this was a dominant way of thinking about citizenship until democratic movements began to contest it and say, actually, no, it's universal, it's for everyone, we need representation. And what for me is really interesting, it's something that's kind of really missing also in the way in which the left tackles. So if you think about the criticism to the universal expansion of the franchise back in the days, in the 19th century, when Democrats were saying against liberals, actually. So there was this more liberal representation, property owning ways of thinking. Mm-hmm. And then there were the radical Democrats who said, no, we need to expand the franchise. And often the critique against that universal expansion was, but you need competencies. So how can people become voting if they don't read and write, for example? Mm. And now you see that with migrants. So you constantly have these discussions around, well, isn't it reasonable to ask migrants to speak the national language and not give them rights because they can't speak the national language and so on. And all of these are very regressive, anti-democratic proposals, because they are exactly like the proposals of the people who were resisting democratic expansion on the basis of these arguments, and were rejected with good reason, saying that actually you need representation and there are ways in which you can be represented and you can speak for yourself and have agency. And democratic education, participation in democratic structures, solidarity building were very important elements of how you could actually include even people who on the face of it seemed to be deprived of the resources of inclusion in the public sphere. And the fact that we've lost all of that and we've gone back to this very, impoverished way of thinking about citizenship, which says, well, surely we can ask migrants to take language courses before they become German citizens, for example, or to show that they deserve that they are German citizens. For me, it's like a really regressive and also profoundly oppressive, actually, thing. And the fact that almost no actors on the left will stand up and resist that and give the arguments against it is really revealing of something fundamentally rotten in the left.
Yeah. I'm sure many will be like, why would she be against making immigrants learn German?
Well, it's not about making immigrants learn German. It's more, what is that argument doing to disenfranchise people who are otherwise working? So you need to turn the table. You need to kind of turn the argument and say, well, what is the problem of giving a voice in the political sphere to someone that you're constantly exploiting and on whose labor you are relying to build your life? Why should that person not have the right to vote, for example? And the question of language and competences is irrelevant, because the question is, how do you justify a system that oppresses people? And the system oppresses if you have no voice in the system. Mm-hmm. So how can you justify a structure that is purely coercive for some? And then the question of how you then build the competences and what it takes to become then an agent, a democratic agent, that can take many forms. It can take the learning German, but it can also take the form of creating unions and creating structures of solidarity and making sure that there are education groups and that there are so many possibilities there. So why do we need to restrict it with this one criterion that the state gives us on, you need to be forced to speak the language and take the test to show that you deserve? No, you need to be given a voice in a context in which you're exploited.
You just mentioned this, since I was talking about the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. I mean, whenever there are elections in Germany, like federal elections, 12 million adults in Germany cannot vote, although they live here.
Yeah,
exactly. They pay taxes.
I know, absolutely,
but they are not represented.
Yeah.
Your idea of a mandatory citizenship for immigrants addresses that, right?
Yeah, it addresses that, but also, there's so many other questions, like, why is this question never raised when it comes to giving citizenship to oligarchs? Whoever worries about rich people not speaking the language when it comes to giving them opportunities because they said that they would invest in a certain countries? Why do we not worry about that? I mean, there's so many other concerns that come about. The problem with the citizenship has become the way in which people talk about citizenship is as if it was an entitlement. So the idea that you deserve, you buy, you sell, you trade, it becomes a kind of transactional thing. And the whole point behind citizenship, at least understood in this democratic way, is that citizenship is a vehicle of political emancipation. It's a way in which you can fight exploitation and disenfranchisement in the public sphere. It's a tool for political action. It's not something that you need to show that you deserve. It's not an entitlement. It's not something that someone out there grants because of their own generosity or when they decided that you belong or because they've had some conversation around what it takes to integrate migrants and you need to show that you can actually really integrate. This is just completely the wrong way of thinking about citizenship if you're a Democrat and from a democratic perspective. And of course, I understand why people who have certain economic interests to protect and want in their interest to have migrants without rights, for example, it's in their interest to have disenfranchisement because people are a lot easier to exploit if they have no rights. So of course you can take advantage of their labor. But what I don't understand is why social democrats, why the left is accepting this narrative and not fighting back on behalf of this alternative way of thinking about citizenship.
Have you asked them? I mean, you're not a nobody in Europe. You get around. You probably speak at social democratic party events.
Yeah.
Have you ever asked them why the fuck?
Sure. Yeah, I have asked them. Yeah.
What did they say?
They say They say that we need to win elections and that you can only come to power by making certain compromises. And unfortunately, this compromise around what democracy means seems to be one that they have decided to make.
Is that a good argument?
Well, no, it's obviously not a good argument, but for me, it's interesting that that people are still voting for them, because I think you can also flip the question and ask the people the voting public, why are they rewarding such parties with still endorsing them? And why is there, I'm hoping there will be at some point an alternative that emerges and that fights back on this and turns the conversations around, and then they won't be rewarded with it anymore. But it becomes it's like, your money or your life. It becomes like the kidnappers argument that says if you don't vote for me, then these other guys are coming to power. And so this is what we're all subject to with the mainstream social democratic parties, unfortunately, that it becomes this way in which we are threatened if we don't comply with someone else coming to power. And then this is how this narrative kicks in, where the left is constantly chasing the right on migration, on citizenship, on democracy, on capitalism.
Is there any country in the West where you see the left doing things right? Or the way you favor?
I'm not sure, because I think in recent years, a lot of even the radical left, I mean, there are different problems in different countries, right? So sometimes the radical left becomes extremely nationalist. So on migration, I'm not really sure that I haven't seen much progress even on many radical left parties. I think it becomes a more kind of group-specific thing. And there are certainly movements and political agents that somehow try to, but I don't think they're the ones that are really gathering consensus. I'm not sure.
I'm sure my audience will probably ask about Mamdani.
Yeah.
Have you followed him?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What do you say?
My line is that socialism in one state was hard enough, so socialism in one city is probably going to be even harder. But I think it was and so I think it's just a real challenge, and it's going to be really, really difficult for this movement because the expectations are so high and the investment is so big, and the context in which it needs to operate is a really, really challenging one because, as I say, socialism in one city is hard.
He's not in charge of the money.
Well, exactly.
I read. Like the New York State.
But on the other hand, I think it's also important to remember that it's important that there is this counter movement, and so that there is clearly a way of framing discussions around justice, equality, geopolitics that isn't just reproducing the dominant narrative. And I think it's really important that this discourse, in fact, can succeed also electorally. So exactly to make the argument against the compromising left, to show that actually there may be parts of the left, there may be groups out there that have built their campaign not on identity questions, not on disenfranchisement, not on accepting the mainstream on certain questions, and still have succeeded. So in that sense, it's a very important symbolic. It's very, very important from a symbolic point of view, but it's also because the stakes are so high. This is why we need to be mindful of the fact that it's also very challenging, and that this will be very easily deployed and used and framed if it fails as, there you go, you tried it, you had your alternative, and what did Mamdani do, and so on.
Did you see him visiting the White House this weekend?
Yeah.
It was amazing, this short exchange.
Yeah.
And like when they talked about some issues, it was clear like this is not about left and right.
Yeah.
Because like Trump represents the very top.
Yeah.
The very rich.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mamdani represents the poor and the bottom of society.
Yeah. Yeah, but on the other hand, you could also see that the way the Trumpists, the MAGA movement, has been driving its campaign also based on some social questions forward. And that's what has enabled them to then, this is what enables Trump to say, we've agreed on so many things, because there was a sense in which some sections of the far right were campaigning in favor of some social justice things that they felt had been completely, and that people voted for them because they felt they had been completely marginalized by the mainstream Democratic Party and by the Democratic elite and also by the Republican elite. And so there was this element of
the whole MAGA
populist
movement,
mobilization.
the whole MAGA movement came out of the Tea Party movement after the financial crisis, and Obama, the Democratic president, bailing out the perpetrators.
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. So I think a lot of the far right has flourished because of that critique of globalization. And in fact, sometimes I've been in debates occasionally with I remember a few months ago I was in a television in Italy and talking to one of the Brothers of Italy MPs, and as it was a bit like Mamdani and Trump, somehow there was a critique of globalization that emerged, and if you weren't talking about migration, you could see how there were arguments about that critique of globalization that really also appealed to Brothers of Italy, and they had been driving with this anti-EU is elitist, and the EU needs to deliver for the people, and it's not delivering for the people, and so this people and elite axis. And of course, the way to get into the differences and explain what is different between that project and my project is exactly questions of migration and membership.
You don't have a lot of time, so maybe come back some other day. Because we need a few minutes for the audience questions. But let's end with the topic of AI, because 100 years ago, the Wall Street crash in 1929 led to all the catastrophes later in the 30s. I'm kind of afraid that the AI bubble is going to burst someday soon. And this will trigger another global financial crisis. Because it has to come at some point. We talked about Marx. It will happen at some point, the crisis.
Yeah.
Are you afraid that the AI bubble, financial crisis, will come soon?
Yeah, I don't know when, but it will come, because capitalism is made of booms and busts, and all the capitalists know that as well. So it's not that it's. I don't think it's going to be news for anyone that there will be a bubble and that it will crash that it will burst at some point.
But do you see this bubble bursting leading to economic catastrophes? And
it will lead to economic catastrophes. It will lead to a lot of, loss of jobs, unemployment, disenfranchisement, conflict, geopolitical conflict. It will lead to conflicts over resources and competition outside. And it will lead to war. And I think there is nothing in the crisis of capitalism that promises a better world. And whether there is a better world, whether there is a way of emerging from it that is more constructive, that all depends on political projects. So I don't think there is sort of agency there. And if there is no narrative that counters capitalism, if there's no vision of an alternative society, if there's no sense of a world that could be beyond war and beyond capitalism, then more fascists will win, and they will be even more aggressive than the fascists of now, because the crisis will be even deeper.
So basically, from what I take from this conversation, the next crisis is coming soon.
Well, I don't want to make predictions of that kind, because I don't have the competences to say when the crisis will come. There will be a crisis, yes, absolutely.
I didn't mean you know, or we know when it's going to come, but at some point
Yeah,
it's going to come.
Yeah, because that is in the nature of capitalist boom. But this is every capitalist knows that there are booms and busts in the economy, and so there has been a boom and there will be a bust.
That's why the left should prepare.
Yeah,
be prepared, because when the crisis is coming, people will demand alternatives.
Yeah,
and so far, at least in Germany or in the West, European West, only fascists are ready.
Yeah.
To take over.
I mean, presumably, what will happen is that the fascists that are now. So this is even more catastrophic scenario. So the fascists that are now in power, because they are in power, they can't say that we have no responsibility over how we respond to crisis. And so what will happen is that there will be other fascists to the right of them that will emerge with the same kind of identity-driven membership narrative, but going even more in the direction of you need to disenfranchise more people. And so now we're discussing, for example, limits on migration, but I think at some point we might begin to discuss disenfranchisement, so loss of citizenship, removal of citizenship for people like me, for example. So that's the next stage, right? Right now we're talking about these Albanians that work in the UK, like Lea, who is a kind of academic, maybe she's fine. And so maybe it's the Albanian immigrants that are illegal that we need to kind of be tougher at the border. The next party that comes, it will be a bit like with Brexit. First they needed to come out of the EU, and then they needed to start saying, actually, the problem is also with the migrants inside the UK. So it wasn't just about coming out of the EU. It's also about unmixing peoples, as I say. When people were in the 1920s and 30s, we're talking about the unmixing of peoples as a way of responding to the financial crisis.
Unmixing.
And I think they will start these narratives, which are there in the fringes. So remigration, the far right talks a lot about remigration. Remigration, in some of its components, isn't just about removing illegal immigrants. It's about removing citizenship from legal immigrants. And I think that's the next far right stage, where they say you have someone who is to the right of the right and says to Trump and to Meloni, no, you're making too many compromises. You're not going hard enough on your culture war. So now we need to think about the people who were not born speaking the language, who speak with an accent, who have... this is what we've seen in the 30s with the narratives against, for example, Jewish people. It started with the Jews who don't integrate and were the ones who practice, even before that, people who practice certain rituals and who are not liberal. And then it became also about liberal people who were actually generations integrated and secular and so on. And I don't think that narrative stopped. So if you want to build potential catastrophic scenario, there's lots of possibilities and actually also lots of historical precedents there.
Lea, that was fun.
Thank you.
Come back at some point.
Definitely, with pleasure.
Are you going back to London today?
Yeah,
all right.
I'm going back to London.
You have a few minutes with Hans.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, Lea.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Great to see you.
Yeah. You enjoyed the interview?
Yeah, it was great. That was really fun.
Fine. It was quite a lively discussion in the chat. That's good. Starting, as you had the topic of AI in the end, there is a question concerning that. What are your thoughts on the world's very first minister for AI, who was established by Albania?
Yeah. I think that it lacks the accountability structures that are required for a minister to operate. I was very concerned by it. I thought at the beginning that it was just a PR stunt. There is a part of me that still thinks it's a PR stunt, but I think there are reasons to be worried by that because
Why?
It has to do with the lack of accountability and democratic transparency.
What do you mean by lack of accountability? I mean, he's the minister, so he is a person who is who can make who can be seen in relation to the questions and problems of artificial intelligence. Isn't that good?
So on the one hand, I don't really know what is behind the technology that produces AI. And so I would like to know more. First of all, there is a question of accountability in the way in which this is set up. And there was no debate. There was no, I think it's a fundamental change in the way in which we conceive of representation by institutions. There was no debate before the election. There was no anticipated question around how would the public respond to it. So there was no consultation. It was it was a decision that emerged without any background preparation in terms of what do citizens need to know when they are being represented in a way that is different from how they have been represented up to now, in a way that departs from the structures that we know. So there's a question of pure representative democracy and the conditions under which representative democracy operates that was missing. And then there is a question around what is behind the technology and how is it's being produced and who benefits. And I mean, I'm not saying that these questions are unanswerable. I'm saying that it's very concerning that they were not part of the debate when this decision was taken, and they continue to not be part of the debate now, and that we are actually not asking ourselves the question of who owns AI, who benefits from AI, how certain algorithms are constructed, what is the possibility for bias in those algorithms, what is the extent to which there is input, how does democratic input work. There is a lot of detail there, which on the most charitable reading needed to be filled in and needs to still be filled in. For one, the person that is the face behind the AI minister in Albania didn't even know that she was going to be the face of the AI minister before. And again, usual, normal human ministers, they have security, there are protocols around security. The fact that this woman whose face is being used behind a robot didn't even know that she was going to be the face behind this seems to me to raise very fundamental questions and concerns.
So your answer seems to prove that you are still very interested and very well informed about current policy in Albania. Is that right?
Yeah. I follow Albanian politics just as I follow British politics, German politics.
Next question. Since democracy only appears in our world in combination with capitalism, does this real existing democracy just stabilize and legitimize the primary system and make social discrepancies possible?
Well, I don't think democracy only emerges with capitalism. I think democracy is a very old idea.
Yes.
And I think, as we were discussing in the show, it's an idea that actually goes back to ancient Greece. And it's this idea of people making decisions as opposed to a small elite making decisions, the few, so the oligarchs. It's a system that emerges in alternative to oligarchy or in alternative to aristocracy, which is where the best make decisions, or in alternative to tyranny, where only one person makes decisions. So I think as a system of rule, it's a very old idea with old roots in ancient
that's
Greek.
why the appendix was in our real world.
Yeah, but if we go back to the ideal of what democracy is, it's not clear that in our real world we have this conception of the people making decisions and structures of accountability and power being responsive to them. And so in that sense, I think the institutions that we have are a mix of all these other different forms of government. And I would say exactly because of capitalism, probably closer to oligarchy right now than to democracy.
Next question is related to that. Your statement, which came quite early in the interview, the EU is not democratic, that's what you said. Does it mean that it's not direct democracy or the EU is not democratic at all?
No, it's neither one of those two. So it's not a direct democracy because also we don't really have a lot of direct democracy. Right. I mean, maybe in Switzerland there is more direct democracy than there is in Germany. So there's places in Europe where there is more approximations to direct democracy. I don't think it's not democratic at all because there is a sense in which there are mechanisms of accountability and democratic accountability that come from the nation states, and so that the voice of the people, the views of people are being filtered by their nation state representatives. And that's why we talk about democratic deficits. I think what I said was that there is a discussion around the democratic deficits of the EU, which was very much part of the EU's own concern with itself, that it had these democratic deficits. And that's where a lot of the discussions around revising the treaties of the EU, when they emerged and when they were being discussed also in the early 2000s, were about remedies to these democratic deficits and ways of thinking about this treaty structure and homogenizing and regulating and thinking about European citizenship in a way that would be a little bit more demanding and that would take action to remedy some of these democratic deficits.
There was one commentator who reacted on one quote, and he said, representation is not democracy. Because in a way, you featured representation a lot.
Yeah, but I think I disagree with that. I think modern democracy is representative democracy. And in the show, in part, we discussed, I think, the questions of scale and the discussion, the difficulties with representing, with somehow having direct mechanisms of democratic deliberation that take no account of representation and they have no representative structures. I would say modern democracy is, by and large, representative democracy. Okay. We can't really call it not representation.
Talking about the EU and the needs of a reform of that system, what's a realistic way to reform the EU into a good direction?
Well, I think political parties within European states need to have demands for changing the EU that go in this progressive direction, and a vision for how the EU could be transformed in this way that I have. I mean, my preferred version, as I said, was a federal socialist direction. So I think a realistic way, the question of realism is a difficult one because what do we mean by realism? Do we mean one that can come to power tomorrow? Or do we mean one where we have some mechanisms of political representation? And I think the party system is one of them that could filter some demands from change and take them to institutions. So voice some concerns and then change the institutional environment.
This question had a second sentence, which reads, and what and how could I, as a normal, regular citizen, participate in that process?
Well, I think citizens participate in that process at various points. I mean, the most important one is when they vote. So I would say you have to think about which parties represent these views and make sure that you vote for those parties and don't vote for the ones that don't reflect those views. I don't think that's a very basic starting point. There are other ways in which we can get mobilized, we can become active, we can be more active in civil society. We can fight exclusion in our workplaces. You know, there are constantly times in which decisions are being made that ask for our compliance, and we sometimes become complicit with things that we don't want to see happen because we feel we have no other choice, and maybe we can resist some of those compromises. But I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to this question because it depends. Different citizens have different opportunities as well. I mean, if you're an illegal migrant or if you're a legal migrant without voting rights, this answer will be very different from if you're someone who already has certain opportunities.
Concerning parties, there was a direct question to you. Which country or party does it best, in your opinion?
So I don't answer this question usually because answering this question commits me to then becoming a voice speaker for that party, party or that country, and also then risks making that party somehow too self-assured and so complacent with its position because it feels that you can get away with. I think the role of philosophers and critical citizens like me is not to actually say who they support, but it's to articulate criticism.
I accept it, of course. May I modify the questions? Could you name 3 parties or countries which might be in the top list of your favorable
Well, we spoke of Mamdani earlier.
Yeah.
I spoke of, I liked the Linke in the last election. They performed well and they seemed to, I think, present a program that was something maybe perhaps closer to what I would endorse. As I say, I don't want to commit myself. In France, there was a popular, a renewed popular front a few months ago where, you know, there was an effort to come together on the left with the renewal
framework
platform.
Which makes it an understandable framework.
I would say any party that fights capitalism, defends migrants, fights nationalism, and does this consistently and coherently on the public sphere is probably worth supporting.
I would like to bring in a question which comes from me. As you were talking about the risk of another rise of fascism or right-wing populism, would you share the opinion that the key slogan, the most successful key slogan of the right-wing populists is "Take back control"? That was a main slogan of the Brexit movement, and I guess it is the inner core of MAGA in the USA. it is the demand of taking back control, which parts of the population are feeling to have lost.
Yes, I think because it points to this gap between the people and the elites, and it points to a need for greater democracy, and it also points to the real democratic disenfranchisement of the vast majority of people as a result of decades of neoliberal policy that has concentrated power in the hands of a few. Of course, in the case of the right, it's a completely disingenuous because it's only take back control for some people.
Sure,
and but I think it does appeal.
It gives an answer. It gives an answer to the feeling of having lost control, of feeling insecure, and so it gives back security. And by experiencing that there is some leadership who promises to give you back the lost control, they don't care anymore about right or left, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think absolutely. It points to this, I would say, not so much the need for security, but the need for agency, for voice, for a group that represents you and makes you feel heard and seen. And I think this is really accounts for quite a lot of the success of those movements.
By security, I don't mean the kind of security given by institutions like police or military, but kind of an inner feeling, knowing where we are, knowing where things can go, are on the right way, that kind of emotional security. Okay. Next question from the audience. Is there an alternative to the current zeitgeist of power-based politics for the EU, meaning leadership, more military, more and cuts to social programs, or will the EU break over this?
Well, I think there is an alternative in the form of the initial projects for the EU that we just mentioned. If you look at this Ventotene manifesto that we were talking about at the beginning, this was one of the founding documents of the EU, and this was, as I was trying to discuss, it was a federal socialist project for the EU. So that is an alternative, and whether that is a realistic or feasible alternative is something that depends on politics. And I don't think any theory can either rule that in or rule that out, because politics depends on human will, and human will depends on what people do and how they act. And so this idea that we have no control over what happens in political life is an illusion, and it's very important to fight that illusion and to remember that we have agency, we have political agency, and that that possibility and the feasibility of those projects cannot be ruled out by fiat.
Next, very personal question. The commentator wrote, I'm a strongly believing atheist. Do you think people would care more for future generations if there would be more religion or a spiritual attitude in the life and discussion? I see a lack of public spirit in people.
Yeah, but I don't think that atheism is the problem there, or that the religion is the only way in which we can have this connection to future generations. I think, if anything, religion gives you, as Marx was saying, was a heart of a heartless world. So it gives you this illusion that something is going.
And also expression of the deepest desire.
Yeah, and it's also
that's the second part of the sentence.
Right, exactly, and in a way, it's there because it fills the gap. And it sort of responds to a real demand for foundations, for value, for solidarity, for community. And it makes all of that somehow possible in some alternative other world. But I don't think that we need to be religious to think about future generations. I think we just have to think about the kinds of commitments and the kinds of projects that we care about, and the kinds of things that our children care about, our relatives, our friends, and our connection to other humans, and what we want of that connection to survive, and how the meaning of a life is in how it survives in these future projects. And you don't have to be at all religious for that. You can be completely atheist and still think that humans matter, and this intra and across generation connection between humans also matters and gives meaning to humanity.
Related to that, and in my view, a real philosophical question is, how big of a problem is the kind of metaphysical homelessness and existential loneliness of the people in modern Western civilization?
I don't think it's a big problem. What is a problem, I think, is the fact that loneliness is there because of a society that atomizes individuals. And so that makes us think, everyone is out there fending for themselves. And so I don't think that it's a metaphysical problem. I think it's a political problem because we live in political economic structures that encourage this atomization of individuals, that encourage a way of thinking about humans as antagonists and competitors to each other, that encourages a economic model that is built on this competition and on this drive for profit. But I think we can think about alternative ways of building society in which we would be connected to each other, in which we would show solidarity. And so I don't think... well, we've been talking about it for 2 hours, so I think not something not so different from what we've just been saying.
Okay. How relevant are the big Eastern or Asian philosophers in the academical philosophy world where you live in right now?
Well, I think there is a drive to decolonize the curriculum and to discuss authors that come also from non-Western countries. And so I wouldn't say that it's the majority or the mainstream, but there is certainly an effort to open up political, or at least in the parts of philosophy that I know best, moral and political philosophy, to open to other ways of thinking about non-European countries and non-European contributions to that, as there are also to thinking about exclusions based on gender, and so to recover philosophy taught by women, including in the past where women weren't seen to be contributors. So I think there is an effort in political philosophy and moral philosophy to diversify existing curriculums and to make them a little bit more open to alternative traditions and alternative subjects.
China is taking more and more a leading role in the world in all dimensions, economically and militarily, also philosophically?
I mean, I don't think it's become, no, I wouldn't say so based on my experience at my university. So I wouldn't say that it's hegemonic from in China right now. The main discussions are around Confucianism. So I wouldn't say that Confucianism has become the mainstream in Western universities, no.
No. But there's now increasing relevance?
Well, I think it's good that there is increasing contact and effort to understand what this huge country that is very hegemonic, both politically and economically, what kind of thought system and what kind of philosophical system it's inspired by or discussing, and what Chinese philosophers are interested in. I think it's very important for us to be as curious about China as China is about Europe. So I think that's a very good thing.
I see. Coming to the last two questions, one commentator picked up your quote, "We are the result of structures." And he said, how does that go along with the idea of self-authorship if we look at people, individuals, as being the result of structures?
Well, there are two ways in which you...
Is it a misunderstanding?
Let me be a little bit more specific. There's two ways in which we are the result of structures. We can say that we are shaped by structures, and we can say that we are determined by structures. I didn't say we're determined by structures. When I say we're the result of structures, I mean that we are in important ways influenced by the structures to which we belong, because there's a genealogy of who we are and of our identity, whereby what we were in the past has an important effect on what we are now. And I don't mean to say that just because of that, we can do nothing other than think within those structures, or so that if you're a woman, you can only think...
We are not popping out of the same mold.
Well, I think we're not determined by the structure. So I think, if you're... to be determined by a structure would mean that if you come from a, for example, rich property-owning family or asset-managing family, then you can only think about capitalism and you can only justify capitalism. And I'm sure there's a lot of viewers out there who come from wealthy families, but somehow also can think critically about their own families, their own background. Historically, Engels was one of them. Engels was the son of a factory owner, and he was also the founder and the contributor of the socialist and communist movement.
Like Frederick Engels. He came from an
that's what I mean,
entrepreneur.
Engels. This is the one I was saying. This is the one I mentioned.
I understood Angus.
Engels.
Yeah,
Engels was the son of a kind of factory mill owner in Manchester.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so he's someone who is shaped by a structure, but not determined by that structure.
Yeah, okay. Would it be a friend of mine, a late friend, an artist, he said, as an artist, all artists always stand on the shoulders of artists from prior and previous generations. Can we say that the development of an individual personality is kind of a dynamic process between social structures of a society and the potential of the individual, and this dynamically react to each other and forms an individual which is influenced by structures but not determined.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that characterization.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Last question comes from me. Something of what you said and explained to me reminds me of what was formerly called the third way. Mm-hmm. And this was, as you came originally from Albania, this quote was very typical for Tito, Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And obviously it didn't work, it failed. When you mentioned that this third way, is there any relation to what had been tried on the Balkans, let's say, in the post-war?
Well, I think the answer to that is going to be a little bit similar, like your answer to what is the existing party that reflects your thinking. And there is a risk that if you commit to a past solution and you say that was a solution, that was the alternative, or if you commit to someone who is in power and you say that is the power vision that I have, then you have to also become responsible for also all the shortcomings of that project and all the limitations. And I think just as with parties in power, with governments of the past in power, there are a number of those limitations. So I don't really see why critical thinking needs to then become stopped and needs to become complicit and end up having to justify certain things that you wouldn't perhaps justify if you were thinking about it just by the constraints of the time. So for me, the point of thinking about past governments and past institution structures isn't to relate to them in this apologetic way that says, well, that was the alternative and we lost the alternative, because that encourages a certain nostalgia. It encourages a way of thinking about the past that doesn't quite settle accounts. It's not critical enough, doesn't go deep enough. And I think the third way needs to be in the future rather than in the past. And so, of course, there are movements, there were openings, there were moments, again, as I was saying earlier, when I said, when we think about what are the movements that you can find inspiration in, there were also movements in 1989 who were fighting state socialism, but were also fighting market capitalism. Havel in the beginning was something like that, and a number of dissident movements in Eastern Europe.
We had the Prague Spring.
Right, the Prague Spring. Yeah. So a number of opposition movements were of that kind. And I think to the extent that they were not cozying up with people in power, to the extent that they weren't justifying any structures that were already out there, but they were about building criticism and developing accounts of the future, I think maybe those are the ones that I would be most sympathetic to.
What's spontaneously the best part of your Albanian heritage?
Well, a number of things. I mean, education, the importance that we place on education, the fact that we spent a lot of time reading books and discussing books. And of course, they were under severe constraints and it was only a certain kind of books, but the value that people placed on education, the fact that education was the currency rather than money making or, something much more superficial, clothes. Or for me, there was something very genuine and very important about that, because I do think that the Enlightenment, of which I'm still a champion, is all about education, and a society that values education and values a very important part of human living and of human being. So, but there were a lot of others. I mean, there was more solidarity in hardship. It was a constrained society marked of scarcity, but in which people came together to try and help each other, because we didn't have commodified services. So you didn't have to go out in the market to buy for babysitters or to buy services. So it was a society in which people came to help each other a lot more. There was more care. There was more care of younger people for older generations. There was all of that, however, in the background of a system that also relied on surveillance and complicity, and just that proximity that was help in times of hardship and need was also something that could get you in trouble because of the spying and surveillance and suspicious that marked. So it was a very complicated setup in which it's hard to be just nostalgic about.
Yes, I see. When you dream, are your dreams usually in English or sometimes in Albanian language as well?
Sometimes they're in Italian as well. So, I think they're in different languages, depending on where I've been. I think I might have even been dreaming in bad German at some point. So.
Well, you have been lecturing in Berlin, as we know.
So.
Okay, Lea, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for your interesting views. And as Thilo said, please come back.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Danke für eure Unterstützung. Thanks for your support, without which this channel wouldn't exist. You know that. Ihr wisst, ohne euch gäbe es das nicht. Supporters of the last month now to be seen in the credits. Thanks and see you soon. Bye.